Elias Crow never even had the decency to meet her at the door. He waited until the entire platform was full, until every man, woman, and child in Coulter's Creek had gathered to watch the mail train unload. And then he walked up to Mara Whitmore in his good Sunday coat with his hat in his hands, and he said it loud enough for all of them to hear, "I'm sorry, Miss Whitmore. I can't go through with it. I've given my heart to another just like that, 6 letters. 6 months of waiting, 1 suitcase, $62. And a man who couldn't even whisper it, the crowd went still. Somewhere behind her, a child laughed at something unrelated, and the sound cut through the silence like a blade. If that were you standing on a frozen platform in a town where you knew no one, with winter biting through your coat and your entire future dissolving in front of strangers, what would you do? Would you weep? Would you run? Would you beg? Mara Whitmore did none of those things. And what happened next changed every life on that platform, including the ones who thought they were just watching. If this kind of story moves you real people, impossible situations, and the quiet strength it takes to survive them, then subscribe to this channel right now and follow Mara's story all the way to the end. You won't want to miss what comes next. Hit the like button and drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to that platform and to the moment Mara Whitmore decided she wasn't done yet. The train had been 4 hours late out of Cheyenne. Mara had spent those 4 hours pressed against a window in the second-class car, watching the Wyoming plains roll past in a gray and colorless wash, the kind of landscape that felt less like land and more like the end of something. She hadn't slept the night before. She'd been too alert, too wound up in the specific anxiety of arrival, the way your stomach tightens when you're about to meet a future you've only read about in ink. She had his letters in her coat pocket, all 6 of them. She'd read them so many times that the paper had softened at the folds, and the ink had worn thin in the places she touched most. Elias Crow wrote the way very few men wrote, not romantic exactly, but considered. He used words like endurance and purpose. He said he wanted a partner, not an ornament. He said Coulter's Creek was hard country, but honest country, and that the woman who could stand it would find herself standing taller than she ever had back east. Mara had believed him. That was the part she would have to live with. She was 28 years old and not naive. She'd worked in her uncle's dry goods store for 6 years after her parents passed, long enough to know what it meant to hold a ledger, manage inventory, deal with difficult men across a counter without flinching. She wasn't looking for a fairy story. She was looking for something real, a place to build, a person to build it with. Ohio had nothing left for her. The house was gone. Her uncle had sold the store. She had her savings and her skills, and the particular kind of courage that comes not from being fearless but from having no other option. When the train finally rolled into Coulter's Creek, she stood up before it fully stopped. Old habit, she was always the first one ready. The platform was crowded for a Saturday afternoon, more crowded than she'd expected. She saw the banner strung between 2 posts, faded and slightly crooked, welcoming new arrivals. She saw a man selling roasted nuts from a cart. She saw women in heavy coats clustered near the depot steps, talking, and men in work clothes leaning against fence rails with the easy posture of people who had nowhere urgent to be. She saw Elias Crow at the far end of the platform, and her heart did what hearts do when they've been waiting 6 months at rows. He was taller than she'd imagined, broad-shouldered, clean-shaven. He was wearing a good coat, the kind you wore when you wanted to look like you'd made decisions. He had his hat in his hands. She walked toward him. The crowd did what crowds do when they sense something is about to happen. They got quiet. Not all at once, but gradually, the way a room quiets when someone walks in who changes the atmosphere. I noticed it. She slowed her steps by a fraction. Elias met her halfway. He didn't smile. "Miss Whitmore," he said. His voice was steady, which somehow made it worse. "Mr. Crow," she said. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he has already made a decision about. Not cruel, not cold. "Just finished. I'm sorry," he said. "I can't go through with it. I've given my heart to another." The words landed in the open air and hung there. Mara heard them the way you hear something you already knew was coming, but prayed wasn't that specific hollow ringing, like a bell struck in an empty room. She didn't speak immediately. That was the first thing people would remember later, when they talked about it. She didn't cry. She didn't grab his arm or raise her voice. She just stood there for a moment, very still, with her suitcase in one hand and the cold Wyoming air cutting across her face, and she looked at Elias Crow with an expression that no one in that crowd could fully interpret. Then she said quietly, "When did you know?" He blinked. He hadn't expected that. "I'm sorry?" "When did you know?" she repeated, and her voice was level, "that this was what you intended to do?" "Because the last letter you sent was 6 weeks ago. I was already on a train when you wrote it." His jaw tightened. It's complicated, Miss Whitmore. Feelings aren't always. I spent $62 getting here," Marissa said. Not as accusation, as fact. That was almost everything I had. Someone in the crowd made a sound. A small sound, half shock, half something like anger on her behalf. Mara didn't look for who it came from. Elias straightened. He had the grace to look ashamed, but not enough grace to do anything about it. I truly am sorry. I hope you'll be able to find your way back too. I'm not going back, Mara said. He stopped. I came to Wyoming, she said. I'm staying in Wyoming. She picked up her suitcase, which she'd set down during the conversation, and she looked at him one last time. I hope the woman you love is worth the cost of your character, mister. I genuinely do. She turned and walked away. The crowd parted for her the way crowds part when they've just witnessed something they didn't expect to respect but do. She didn't run. She walked at exactly the same pace she'd walked toward him, measured, deliberate, as though she had somewhere important to be. She didn't. She had nowhere at all. She made it to the far end of the platform, away from the worst of the crowd, and she set her suitcase down against the depot wall, and she stood there and she breathed. Just breathed. Her hands were shaking inside her gloves, and she pressed her fingernails into her palms, hard, to give the shaking something to push against. Her eyes burned. She didn't let them. What do I do now? Not a question. A task. Because falling apart was a luxury that required a floor to fall onto, and right now the floor had just been pulled out from under her. She had $62, a suitcase, the clothes she was wearing, and a set of skills that had kept her employed for 6 years. She had no room booked. She knew the name of one hotel in Coulter's Creek because Elias had mentioned it in his second letter. She had enough for 2, maybe 3 nights if she was careful. After that, she would need work. What kind of work and where she did not yet know. She was standing there working through these calculations with the practical, methodical focus of someone who had learned early that panic was just energy wasted on problems that didn't move when she heard footsteps, and then a voice. That took more backbone than most men in this county have. She turned. The man standing 6 feet from her was somewhere in his early 40s, with the kind of face that showed years of outdoor work not weathered in a defeated way, but carved down to its essentials. Dark hair going slightly gray at the temples. Eyes the color of creek water in winter, not quite blue, not quite gray. He was wearing working clothes, not his Sunday best, which meant he'd been in town for a reason other than the spectacle. He held his hat in one hand. I wasn't asking for an opinion, Mara said. No, he agreed. You weren't. He didn't look offended. Caleb Hawthorne. I run the Double C about 9 miles northeast. She looked at him the way she had learned to look at men who introduced themselves unexpectedly, measuring, not hostile, but not generous either. Mara Whitmore. I'm sure you already know that I do. He turned his hat once in his hands. I wasn't planning to come over here. I was going to leave you to it. But then I thought if the situation were reversed, and I'd just been left standing on a platform in a town I didn't know, I might want someone to at least acknowledge it. I'm acknowledged, she said. Thank you, he almost smiled. I've got a problem, he said. And I realize this is poor timing, but I'm not sure there'll be a better time. So I'm going to say it anyway. My cook walked off the job 3 weeks ago. I've got 14 men on the payroll, and 2 children who've been eating whatever we can throw together, which isn't much. I need someone who can run a kitchen. The position pays $12 a month with room and board, your own quarters in the main house, and Sundays off. Mara stared at him. He waited. You're offering me a job, she said. I am, right now, standing here. I'm aware the timing is terrible, he said. I'm offering anyway. She looked past him for a moment at the platform, at the remaining clusters of townspeople who were trying not to appear to be watching. She thought about the hotel. She thought about $62. She thought about the 4 hours on that train, and the 6 months of letters, and the specific weight of arriving somewhere you'd planned to belong, and finding that the welcome had already been revoked. She looked back at Caleb Hawthorne. What happened to your last cook? He didn't flinch at the question. She got a better offer. Husband in Laramie. Left on 2 days' notice, and before her, a pause. Heart trouble. She'd been with us 8 years. We missed her considerably, She noted the word. Your children, she said. How old? Nora is 9. Evan just turned 13. And their mother? The pause this time was different. Shorter but heavier, she passed. 14 months ago. Fever. Mara absorbed that. She understood, with the particular understanding of someone who had also lost people, what 14 months meant long enough that people expected you to be getting on with it, not long enough that getting on with it felt like anything but a performance. I need to think about it, she said. Of course. He put his hat back on. I'm loading supplies at the hardware store for the next hour. If you decide you want to hear more, I'll be there. He turned to go. Mr. Hawthorne, he stopped. If I take the position, she said, I run the kitchen. My hours, my methods, my decisions about what gets purchased and when. I'll answer to you about costs and I'll keep a clean ledger, but I won't have workers or anyone else second-guessing how I work. He turned back to her. This time he did smile brief, like the sun through cloud cover. I wouldn't expect anything less, he said. He walked away. Mara watched him go, and then she looked down at her suitcase, and then she looked up at the Wyoming sky, which was the same flat, cold, indifferent gray it had been all morning. She picked up the suitcase and followed him. She didn't follow him immediately to the hardware store. She went first to a small cafe on the main street she spotted it 2 doors down from the depot and ordered coffee and a plate of whatever was cheapest, which turned out to be biscuits and gravy, and she sat in the corner booth and ate and thought. The biscuits were dense, overworked dough. The gravy was thin and undersalted. She noticed these things the way she noticed everything about kitchens automatically, without judgment, just taking inventory. She thought about the offer. $12 a month, room and board, her own quarters. It wasn't luxury, but it was solid. It was more than she'd find in a week of searching, and she knew it. Coulter's Creek didn't look like a town overflowing with positions for a single woman with a suitcase and no local connections. The job was real. The need was genuine. She could see that in the way Hawthorne had asked, the specific practicality of it, not a man trying to do her a favor, but a man with a problem that needed solving. What she didn't know yet was whether the man was trustworthy. She had learned, over 6 years behind a counter, dealing with every kind of customer, that you could tell a lot about a man's character by how he handled inconvenience. Elias Crow had handled inconvenience by waiting until the most public possible moment to deliver the worst possible news, and she suspected he'd told himself it was honesty when really it was cowardice, wearing honesty's coat. Caleb Hawthorne had handled the inconvenience of needing a cook by walking across a platform to speak to a woman who was in state to hear anything, and offering her something real without apologizing for the offer. She didn't know yet if that made him good, but it made him straightforward, and straightforward she could work with. She finished her coffee, left the correct coins on the table, picked up her suitcase, walked to the hardware store. Hawthorne was at the counter when she walked in, going through a list with the store owner, a barrel-chested man with a white beard, who looked up at her arrival with unconcealed curiosity. The store smelled of iron and pine resin, and something that might have been linseed oil. Miss Whitmore, Hawthorne said, no surprise, like he'd expected her. She chose to take that as neither good nor bad. I have conditions, she said. He set his list down. Go ahead. $12 is acceptable, she said. But I'll need a household budget separate from whatever you use for ranch supplies. I'll need to know what it is in the first week, so I can plan accordingly. I'll keep records of everything spent. Agreed. I'll need a tour of the kitchen and pantry before I commit to a start date, because if the situation is genuinely as poor as you described, I'll need to know how much work we're looking at before I can tell you how long it'll take to get things running properly. He nodded. And I'll need one thing more. She held his gaze. I want it understood by you, by your workers, by your children, that my position in your household is professional. I am your cook and your household manager. Nothing more. If there is ever confusion about that, the arrangement ends. He didn't look away. He didn't look uncomfortable. He said, understood completely. The store owner behind the counter, who had been pretending to reorganize a shelf of bolts, gave up pretending and just watched them openly. All right, Mara said. When do we leave? The wagon ride to the Double C took 2 hours along a road that was half frozen mud, half packed snow, and entirely unforgiving of wagon wheels that weren't in good condition. Hawthorne drove. Mara sat beside him on the bench with her suitcase wedged between her feet and the dashboard, wrapped in a blanket he'd produced from behind the seat without comment. She did not thank him excessively. He did not expect her to. They didn't talk much for the first hour. Mara watched the land. Wyoming in early winter was not beautiful in any conventional sense. It was too big for beauty. Too indifferent. The plains rolled out in every direction with a kind of geological patience, as though the land had been here long before any human trouble, and expected to be here long after. The sky sat low and pale over everything. Somewhere far to the north, mountains existed as a theoretical gray smudge. After a while, she asked, "What are they like? Your children?" He was quiet for a moment. She got the sense he was choosing words the way careful men choose tools, not the ones that sounded right, but the ones that would actually do the job. Nora is like her mother, he said. She talks when she's comfortable and not a moment before. She'll watch you for a long time before she decides what to make of you. Once she decides she likes you, she's loyal to a degree that'll embarrass you. A pause. She cries sometimes at night and pretends she doesn't in the morning. Mara looked at her hands. Evan is angry, Hawthorne said. Not bad angry. Just he was 13 when she died, which is the worst possible age for that kind of loss. Old enough to understand it completely, not old enough to know what to do with what he understands. He's been carrying it around like a stone in his boot, and it's made him shorter with people than he used to be. Does he take it out on the workers? He tries to. They've got enough sense to let it pass most of the time. A brief pause. He's a good boy underneath it. I want you to know that. I'll figure out who he is myself, Mara said, not unkindly. Same as he'll figure out who I am. Hawthorne glanced at her. Fair enough. The second hour of the ride, Mara asked about the kitchen. He described it with the particular vagueness of someone who knew it existed but had not spent time analyzing it. He knew the stove was old. He knew the pantry was low. He knew there was a root cellar that he thought had potatoes, and possibly some preserved apples from fall. She extracted what specific information she could and made mental notes, already running preliminary calculations about what could be done with limited supplies and an equipment situation she didn't yet fully understand. When the ranch came into view, she didn't say anything, but she looked. The double C was larger than she'd expected. The main house was 2 stories, built from good timber, and while it had the weathered look of a place that had been working hard for a long time, it was structurally sound. She could see that even from the wagon. The outbuildings were orderly barn, bunkhouse, smokehouse. A small structure she'd later learn was the ice house. Fences stretched in every direction, and through the fence nearest the barn she could see cattle moving in the particular slow way of animals that have learned not to waste energy in cold weather. There were 2 figures on the porch of the main house. One was small and slight, that would be Nora. The other was taller, standing with the carefully manufactured indifference of a 13-year-old boy who wanted to appear as though he'd been standing there for completely unrelated reasons. Hawthorne brought the wagon around and stopped in front of the porch steps. He climbed down and came around to offer a hand. Mara accepted it, not because she needed the help, but because refusing it in front of the children struck her as the wrong first impression. She stepped down and looked up at the porch. Nora was watching her with round, serious eyes, holding the porch railing with both hands. She had dark hair like her father, and she was wrapped in a coat 2 sizes too large that she was probably swimming in all winter. Evan was pretending to look somewhere else. "Nora, Evan," Hawthorne said. "This is Miss Whitmore. She'll be taking care of the kitchen." Nora said very quietly, "Hello?" Evan said nothing. He turned and went inside. The door closed behind him with a sound that was not quite a slam. He was careful enough to stop it just short, but the intention behind it was clear. Mara watched the door for a moment, then she looked at Nora. "That coat's too big for you," Mara said. Nora blinked. "It was my mother's." "I know," Mara said simply, without softening it or inflating it. "Can you show me the kitchen? I want to know what I'm working with before it gets dark." Nora let go of the railing. She came down the steps. She led Mara past her father and around the side of the house to the kitchen door, and she opened it and stood back in the way of a person who is half proud and half embarrassed of what's inside. Mara stepped in. She looked around. The kitchen was cold. The stove had been banked low and hadn't been properly blacked in some time. The table was large enough good, that meant she could work at scale. The pantry door was open and she could see the shelves were at less than a third capacity. There was dried flour, a crock of lard, some salt, a small sack of cornmeal, a few tins she'd have to examine, and a string of onions that had been there long enough to show soft spots. The tools were adequate, not good, but adequate. 2 cast iron skillets, both seasoned, which told her the previous cook had known what she was doing. A large soup pot, rolling pin, bread pans, a grater. Canning jars on the high shelf, about a dozen. Mara walked to the window and looked out at the root cellar door behind the house. "Is there someone with a key to that?" she asked. "Papa has it," Nora said. "He gave me one too, for when I'm helping." "You help with cooking?" Nora's chin came up by a fraction. "I can make cornbread," she said. "And I know how to salt pork." "Good," Mara said. "That's more than most." She turned from the window and looked at the stove and then at the wood box beside it, which was nearly empty. "First thing tomorrow I need a full wood box. Can you tell me who to ask?" "That's Chester's job," Nora said. "He won't do it if you just tell him. You have to ask Papa first." Mara filed that all right. "Let me see the pantry properly." She spent 40 minutes going through every shelf, every tin, every crock, making notes in the small notebook she kept in her coat pocket. Nora trailed behind her, not speaking, but watching everything with those round, serious eyes that didn't miss anything. Mara didn't try to make conversation. She didn't try to be warm in any performed way. She just worked, methodically, making her list, and she let the girl watch. By the time she'd finished, she had a complete inventory and a rough sense of what was possible in the first week. She'd need a supply run within 3 days. There wasn't enough here to feed 14 working men properly, let alone with any quality. But there was enough for tonight. She looked at Nora. "Do you eat supper with the workers or separately?" "We used to eat with them," Nora said. "Before. And now?" Nora shrugged in a way that was trying very hard to be casual and wasn't quite succeeding. "Papa eats with whoever's there. Evan doesn't come down much." Mara nodded. "Tell your father supper in 2 hours," she said. "All of them workers and family. One table if there's room, separate if not, but everyone eats at the same time." She paused. "And see if you can get Evan to come down." Nora's eyes shifted. "He won't. Ask him anyway," Mara said. She turned to the stove and began building the fire. She made bean soup with the salt pork and the onions, and what dried herbs she found on the back shelf, and cornbread from the meal, and she used the last of a small jar of preserved plum. She found it tucked behind the tins, half forgotten to glaze the top of the cornbread in the last 5 minutes of baking. So it came out with a dark, sweet crust that filled the kitchen with a smell that was almost indecent in how good it was. The workers came in cold and tired. There were 8 of them for supper that night. The rest were out on a late ride that Hawthorne had warned her about when he'd shown her to her quarters upstairs, a small room with a clean bed and a window that looked east, so she'd see the sunrise. She had not taken long to look at it. She'd come straight back down to the kitchen. The men sat at the long table in the dining room, and they were quiet when the soup came out, not the silence of politeness, but the silence of people who hadn't eaten properly in weeks and were almost afraid to start. One of them, a young man with frost-burned cheeks and a mustache that was trying harder than it was succeeding, said something appreciative under his breath that she chose not to acknowledge. Caleb Hawthorne sat at the head of the table. Nora sat beside him. The chair across from Nora was empty. Mara had said it anyway. She brought the cornbread out last and set it in the center of the table and went back to the kitchen, because that was where she belonged right now. She ate her own soup standing at the kitchen counter, looking at the inventory list, already thinking about what would need to change and in what order. She was halfway through her bowl when she heard a creak on the stairs. She didn't look up. Footsteps crossed the dining room. A chair scraped, then silence again, except for the sound of spoon on bowl. She looked up then through the kitchen doorway. Evan Hawthorne was sitting in the empty chair, hunched over his soup, eating in the way of someone who had not intended to be there, and was working very hard to seem as though his being there meant nothing. Nora was watching him from across the table with an expression Mara couldn't fully read, but suspected was relief. Caleb Hawthorne said nothing, he just ate his soup. But Mara caught, just for a second, the slight loosening around his eyes, the specific expression of a man who had been holding his breath about something for a long time, and had just been allowed to exhale. Mara looked back at her soup. She finished it. She washed her bowl and set it to dry. Then she picked up her notebook and her pencil and her lantern, and went back to the pantry and kept working, because there was an entire ranch to feed tomorrow, and she had just gotten started. Outside, the Wyoming wind had picked up. It shook the kitchen window in its frame and pressed against the walls of the house with the patient, indifferent force of something that had been moving across this plain for 1,000 years, and would still be moving when all of them were gone. Mara pulled her coat tighter and kept writing. She didn't think about Elias Crow. She didn't think about the platform, or the $62, or the 6 letters still folded in her pocket. She thought about what she needed, and what she had, and what she could make from the distance between them. That was the only arithmetic that mattered tonight. The woodbox was full by the time Mara came downstairs the next morning. She noticed it before she noticed anything else, the neat stack of split pine beside the stove, enough for a full day's cooking, and then some. Chester, apparently, had gotten the message, though she doubted Hawthorne had said much more than a few words. Some men responded to economy of language more readily than they responded to explanation. She filed that away. She built the fire before the sun was properly up, working by lantern light, and by the time the first gray leaked through the kitchen window, she had water heating and was going through the pantry again with fresh eyes, the eyes of someone who had slept on it rather than stared at it with travel fatigue. The inventory looked the same but felt different in the morning. The gap between what was there and what was needed was significant but not hopeless. She made oatmeal with the last of the rolled oats, stretched with a little cornmeal to give it body, and she fried the remaining side of salt pork in thin slices and set it out on a platter, and made a pot of coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. The men came into the dining room in stages, still pulling on coats, not quite talking yet, and they ate without complaint, which in her experience was the most honest compliment a working man could give. The young one with the frost-burned cheeks, she'd learned his name was Tommy, Thomas Birch, 17 years old, and on his second winter at the Double C, came back to the kitchen window after breakfast with his empty bowl. "Ma'am," he said, "that was the best oatmeal I've ever had." "It's oatmeal," she said. "Don't set your standards on it." He grinned and left. But she saw him tell something to the man beside him on the way out, couldn't hear it, but saw the other man glance back toward the kitchen, and she understood that the morning had begun on a slightly better footing than the one she'd walked in on last night. Hawthorne found her in the pantry an hour later, after the men had ridden out. "I need to go to town for supplies," she said, without looking up from her list. "Today, if possible. Tomorrow at the latest. I can take you this afternoon. I've got a meeting in the morning." She handed him the list. He looked at it. His eyebrows rose slightly. "Some of these are not luxuries," she said. "Dried beans, lard, flour, at least 50 pounds. Salt, sugar, cornmeal, baking powder, a proper cut of beef if Hendrik still has any, you mentioned him. Dried fruit if we can get it, because winter without fruit in the diet starts showing by February in ways you don't want. She paused. The molasses is not optional. Molasses bread will stretch the flour and keep the men from burning through their energy by midday, which means you lose less work time in the afternoons. He read further down the list. You want apple cider vinegar. For pickling. If we start now with what's in the root cellar, we'll have something worth eating come January. He folded the list. All right. I'll need a household budget number, she said. You agreed to that. $30 a month, he said. Including your wage, she did the calculation in her head. $18 per month for actual supplies. It was tight but workable if she was disciplined about waste, which she was. She had never in her life wasted food. She understood at a cellular level what it cost. I'll make it work, she said. He nodded and left her to it. She went back to her list and added 2 more items she'd forgotten: cheesecloth and twine, because you always forgot the small things until you desperately needed them. Nora appeared in the kitchen doorway at 9 in the morning, with the careful, hovering energy of a child who wanted to ask something, but hadn't found the angle yet. Mara was kneading bread dough. She'd found a small amount of yeast, enough for 1 batch, and she wasn't going to waste it, and she didn't stop or look up, but she said, "You can come in. You don't have to stand there." Nora came in and sat at the kitchen table with the posture of a girl who had been told many times to sit up straight and had mostly listened. "Are you going to town today?" she asked. "This afternoon." "Can I come?" Mara thought about it. There was no reason to refuse. There was also no reason to make it into something it wasn't. If your father says it's all right. Nora's expression shifted in a way that Mara was beginning to recognize, a slight tightening around the eyes that meant something she wasn't going to say out loud yet. "He'll say yes if you ask. Then you ask him. He says yes faster when it's you." Mara pressed her knuckles into the dough and turned it. "How would you know that?" "I've been here one day." Nora was quiet for a moment. "He was different at supper last night." Mara waited. "He used to talk during supper," the girl said. "Before Mama got sick, he talked all the time. After, he just eats. But last night he asked Chester about the south fence, and Chester said something that made him almost laugh." She said this last part carefully, like it was a thing she was still deciding whether to believe. "He almost laughed." Mara flipped the dough. "Your father's allowed to almost laugh." "I know," Nora said too quickly, with the specific defensiveness of someone who knew they were being illogical but couldn't fully stop. "I know that." Mara let the silence settle for a moment. Then she said, "You want to know how to make bread?" Nora's chin came up. "I already told you I know cornbread. This is different. Yeast bread. Harder, but worth it. Come here." Nora got up from the table and came to stand beside her. She was small for 9, or maybe 9 was just small. Mara had lost track of what children were supposed to look like at various ages, and she had to stand on her toes slightly to see over the edge of the work table. Mara walked her through it. How to check the dough: press it with 2 fingers and watch how it springs back. Too slow means it needs more kneading. Too fast means it's been overworked. How to tell by feel rather than by clock. She let Nora's hands into the dough at one point, guiding them briefly, and felt the girl's initial uncertainty give way to something more interested, the particular focus that comes when your hands are doing something real. They worked without talking much. The kitchen smelled of yeast and something warming and alive, and outside the wind had picked up again. But inside the stove was working steadily, now the way a stove does when it's been properly fed and given time to find its temperature. At one point Nora asked, very casually, as though she'd just thought of it, "Did you have a mother who taught you this?" "No," Mara said. "My mother died when I was 12. Nora's hand stopped in the dough. "I taught myself," Mara said. "Mostly from trial and error." "Mostly error." She shaped the dough into the pan. "My first loaf was so dense I nearly broke a tooth on it." Nora stared at the dough in the pan. "I broke a tooth once," she said, "on a hard candy." "Those things are basically weapons," Mara said. Something crossed Nora's face that was not quite a smile but was definitely related to one. They went to town that afternoon. All 3 of them, Mara, Hawthorne, and Nora, on the wagon bench, with Nora wedged between the 2 adults, and apparently very pleased about this fact, though she was working hard to look neutral about it. The trip to Coulter's Creek was 2 hours in the cold, and Mara spent most of it going through her list in her head, organizing the order of purchases by store hardware for the cheesecloth and twine, and a new knife she'd noted was missing from the kitchen, general store for the dry goods, butcher last so the meat would stay cold longest on the ride back. Hawthorne drove without talking much, which she appreciated. Nora talked enough for both of them, not non-stop, not the chattering of a nervous child, but in the intermittent, thoughtful way of a girl who had real things to say and was deciding which ones were worth saying. She pointed out landmarks along the road, the dead cottonwood that got struck by lightning last summer and was now a particular shape, if you looked at it right. the place where a creek crossed the road that froze every year and was treacherous in early winter. The Hendricks farm in the distance, which was only a farm and not a ranch, and which Tommy Birch maintained, was because old Hendricks was too lazy to keep more than 20 head. Don't repeat that to anyone in town, Hawthorne said. I know, Papa. Tommy says things. Tommy says a lot of things, Nora agreed, with the mild judgment of someone twice her age. They hit the edge of Coulter's Creek just after noon. The town was quieter than it had been. The day before Saturday had its own specific energy, the energy of people catching up on everything the work week compressed, and Tuesday was simply Tuesday. A few horses at the rail in front of the general store. A woman Mara didn't recognize crossing the street with a basket. A cluster of men outside the barber shop. Mara felt the town notice them. Not obviously. Not rudely, more like the subtle shift in ambient attention that happens in any small community when something slightly new appears in its landscape. She was slightly new, she understood this. She didn't try to manage it. Inside the general store, she worked through her list with the focused efficiency of someone who had learned to shop for a large household on a tight margin. The store owner, a thin man named Aldrich, with spectacles that sat slightly crooked on his nose, watched her at first with the cautious manner of someone who wasn't sure what category she fell into, and then with the increasing interest of someone who was recognizing a particular kind of customer, the kind who knew exactly what they wanted, bought what they needed and nothing more, and was very clear about quality. This cornmeal, she said, examining the top of the barrel. When did you open this? Aldrich blinked. Last week, it's damp. She showed him, lifted a handful and let it fall, and he could see the way it clumped slightly. I need dry meal. Do you have another barrel? He did. She inspected that one too, found it acceptable, and noted the amount she needed. By the time she'd been through the store, 20 minutes, Aldrich was no longer watching her with uncertainty. He was answering her questions directly and pulling things from shelves before she asked, because she'd established a pattern he could work with. Hawthorne paid the bill without looking at the total first, which told her he trusted her assessment, which was good because she intended to keep deserving it. They were loading the wagon when she heard Elias Crow's voice behind her. She'd wondered when this would happen. She supposed Tuesday was as good a day as any. Miss Whitmore, he said. She finished positioning the flour sack before she turned around. She gave herself those 3 seconds. Then she turned. He was with a woman younger than Mara, with light hair, and a pretty, uncertain face, the face of someone who knew enough about the situation to be uncomfortable, but not enough to know what to do about it. This, then, was the woman he'd given his heart to. She looked like someone who hadn't asked for any of this, Mr. Crow, Mara said. He looked at the wagon. He looked at Hawthorne, who was on the other side of it, and had gone very still. He looked back at Mara. I wanted to say I'm glad you found a position. I heard you'd gone to the Double C News Travels, she said. It does. He cleared his throat. The woman beside him was staring at a point somewhere past Mara's left shoulder. I hope there are no hard feelings. Mara looked at him for a moment. Not with anger, she'd been genuinely surprised to discover, waking up that first morning at the ranch with work to do, that what she felt toward Elias Crow was closer to blankness than bitterness. He had turned out to be a smaller person than his letters suggested, and that was disappointing rather than devastating. I don't have hard feelings, she said. I have 50 pounds of cornmeal to get home before dark. Good afternoon, Mr. Crow. She turned back to the wagon. Nora, who had been watching from the wagon bench with enormous eyes, caught her gaze and quickly arranged her face into a more neutral expression. Hawthorne glanced at her as he untied the horses. He said nothing. But there was something in the quality of his silence that felt to Mara, like the specific silence of a man who was thinking something he approved of, but had enough sense not to say. They drove out of Coulter's Creek with the wagon loaded, and the winter light already starting to change on the plains. The kitchen was different by the end of the first full week. Not transformed, transformation was the word people used in stories, in the sudden, satisfying way of fairy tales, and this was not that. This was slower and less elegant. This was 14 small corrections accumulating into something better. She'd reorganized the pantry on day 2, moved the heavy items to lower shelves, put the frequently used things at arm level, created a system for tracking what was running low. Small thing. But it meant she wasn't hunting for the baking powder every morning and losing 3 minutes to a search that compounded into real time by the end of the week. She'd established a bread schedule, 2 loaves every other day, or more if the week's plan called for extra hands. Molasses bread on Fridays, because the sweetness of it at the end of the week functioned as something between a reward and a morale maintenance strategy. She'd discovered this not from any theory, but from watching the men's faces when the Friday loaves came out, some in them unclenched, some minor tightening that accumulated through the hard days of the week, and the bread undid it. She'd gotten the stove properly regulated. That had taken 4 days and some strong language spoken quietly. Alone, in the kitchen, the stove had a particular temperature it liked and didn't achieve it gracefully, and learning its tendencies was the work of attention and patience and some burned test biscuits she'd fed to the dog rather than admit to. The dog she hadn't known there was a dog until day 3, when it appeared at the kitchen door and sat there with the expression of an animal that had learned patience through experience. It was a large, rough-coated gray mutt, with one ear that stood up and one that didn't, and it had been living off scripts on whatever Tommy Birch sneaked it from his own plate. She started giving it the trimmings and the burned test batches, and after a week it had transferred its primary loyalty from Tommy to the kitchen door, which Tommy complained about in a way that was almost entirely good-humored. The men ate better. That was measurable in specific, concrete ways. Chester, who had been managing a persistent cough that she suspected was partly from cold and partly from poor nutrition, improved noticeably by day 10. 2 of the other hands, brothers named Red and Pete Garber, who had come down from Montana 2 seasons back, and still seemed slightly offended by Wyoming winters, stopped eating like men who were rationing and started eating like men who expected to be fed properly. Their work improved correspondingly, and she knew because Hawthorne mentioned it to her, once indirectly, saying that the south fence repair had gone faster than he'd expected this week. She understood what he was telling her. She accepted it in the same indirect way. She didn't need applause. She needed to know the work was doing what she'd designed it to do. The harder work, the work that didn't have a ledger, was the children. Nora she understood by the end of the first week. The girl operated on a clear logic. She was loyal to the things she'd decided to trust, and she hadn't yet decided about Mara, but she was gathering evidence. She came to the kitchen every morning to watch, asked questions with the careful precision of someone who wanted real answers rather than reassurance, and had taken over the task of feeding the dog in the mornings, which was not a kitchen responsibility, but which Mara had let happen without comment, because some things mattered more than jurisdiction. Evan was different. Evan was a project she had not yet figured out how to begin. He ate. He came down every night for supper. She gave him credit for that, because she knew from Nora that he'd stopped eating with the family in the months after his mother died, had taken plates to his room. He sat at the table. He ate what was put in front of him. He did not engage. She didn't push him. She'd watched enough people manage grief badly to know that pushing was the surest way to create resistance. She let him eat in silence. She let him come and go without comment. But she paid attention, the way she paid attention to the stove, not forcing anything, just learning its tendencies. What she noticed, Evan was smart. Not in the performing, demonstrating way he didn't show it, didn't talk about it, but she could see it in how he listened. When the ranch hands talked at supper, he took in information with a specific quality of attention that wasn't a child's general interest, but something more analytical. He noticed things. He remembered them. Twice she'd seen him correct something Tommy said about a property boundary or a head count, quietly, without drama, and both times he'd been right. He was also watching her. She caught it twice in the week indirectly, the way you catch a reflection in a window you weren't expecting. He wasn't hostile exactly. He was, she thought about the word waiting. Waiting to see what she would do with whatever space she occupied in his world. She decided not to force the issue and let him wait. The rumors started in the second week. She didn't hear them directly at first. She heard them the way most things in small towns are heard secondhand, through a person who felt she deserved to know, which in this case was Tommy Birch, who appeared at the kitchen door one evening with the expression of someone who has recently been given uncomfortable information and has not yet decided what to do with it. "Ma'am," he said, "I heard something in town on Saturday that you probably ought to know." "Come in," she said. She was making a pie crust. She'd finally gotten the lard supply to a level where she could justify pastry, and she didn't stop. "Say it straight." He came in and stood with his hat in his hands in the exact posture she noted that Caleb Hawthorne used when he had something to say that he wasn't sure how to begin. She wondered if Tommy had picked it up from proximity, or if it was just a Wyoming man habit. "People are saying," he said, "that you planned it, the whole thing. That you came out here knowing Crow would reject you, specifically so you'd end up at the Double C." Mara's hands kept moving in the dough. "Why would I do that?" Tommy's jaw shifted. He clearly hadn't thought through the logic of the rumor before delivering it, and was now doing so in real time. "I guess because of Mr. Hawthorne, because of the ranch. Because you wanted a better situation than marrying a man who runs a mid-sized farm," she said, "instead of managing a kitchen for a man who runs a large cattle operation. For $12 a month and room and board." Tommy blinked. "Think about whether that makes sense," she said. She turned the dough. "Who's saying it?" He hesitated. "I'm not going to do anything about it," she said. "I just want to know where it's coming from." "It started with Crow," Tommy said. "Or someone who knows him. Someone at the feed store said they heard it from a man who works Crow's property. She nodded. She'd expected something from that direction eventually. A man who had done what Elias Crow had done publicly, on a train platform, with witnesses, had two ways to manage the story afterward. He could own it, take the embarrassment, let it settle. Or he could reshape it, make himself less the person who had done something callous, and more the person who had narrowly escaped something calculated. She'd hoped for the former. She wasn't surprised by the latter. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "What are you going to do?" "Make this pie crust," she said, "and then make dinner. And then tomorrow I'll do the same." She pressed the dough into the pan. "The people whose opinion matters to me are in this house. The people in Coulter's Creek can think what they like. I'll prove what I am through the work, same as I always have." Tommy seemed to absorb this. He nodded slowly, like someone agreeing with a piece of advice he'd expected to find less satisfying than he did. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He put his hat back on. He went out. She finished the crust and lined it, and began working on the filling dried apple, with a little molasses and cinnamon. 'Cause the apples she'd bought in town were meant to be stored, but she'd found two in the root cellar that were going soft at the stem end, and were better cooked than wasted. Waste bothered her at a level that was almost physical. She'd learned too young what it cost to lose things you couldn't replace. The problem with Elias Crow was that he didn't know when to stop. She learned this in the third week, when Hawthorne came to find her in the kitchen after supper, with a look she hadn't seen from him yet, not anger exactly, but the controlled stillness of a man who is managing anger carefully, because he can't afford to let it out. He sat down at the kitchen table, which he'd never done before, and she turned from the sink, because that the sitting, the informality of it, was a signal that this was not a quick, practical conversation. "Crow has been talking to the county land office," he said. She waited. "There's a stretch of the north boundary about 200 acres bordering his leased land. The survey from when my father bought this property in '71 is it's not as clean as it should be. Crow is arguing that the boundary runs about a quarter-mile south of where my father always understood it to be." He paused. "If he's right, we lose access to the winter grazing land on that slope, which means moving about 60 head south earlier than the feed out there can sustain." Mara looked at him. "Is he right?" "I don't believe he is. But the '71 survey uses language, that's its legal language. I'm not a lawyer, and the land office has agreed to review it." He put both hands flat on the table. "Which means there's a case being made." She thought about this. "What do you need?" "An old survey map my father had made in '73. He had a dispute with his neighbor to the west back then, resolved it himself, had a proper measurement done. If that survey still exists, and the boundary matches what I believe it is, it ends the argument." He looked at her. "I haven't seen it in years. I don't know exactly where my father kept it." "Where are his papers?" "Storage room. End of the upper hall. Boxes from when he died." She nodded. "I'll mention it to Evan." Hawthorne's expression shifted a small, complicated shift. "Evans, he doesn't go into that storage room. Why not? Some of his grandfather's things are in there. He was close with my father." He stopped. "Another loss," she said. "Yes." She thought about Evan, about the quality of attention she'd noticed in him, the intelligence that had no current outlet, the way grief sat on him like ballast, keeping him from rising. She thought about what it might mean for a boy, carrying a stone in his boot, to be given something specific and real to look for. "Let me handle it," she said. Hawthorne looked at her for a long moment. "He's going to push back." "I know," she said. She found Evan the next morning in the barn, doing what 13-year-old boys do when they have energy, and nowhere to put it, reorganizing something that didn't need reorganizing, moving things from one side to the other without real purpose. He heard her come in and stiffened slightly, the way he always stiffened when she appeared, and she'd learned by now to simply proceed as though she hadn't noticed. "I need your help," she said. He looked at her with the specific suspicion of a boy who has been asked for help before in ways that turned out to be management rather than actual help. "With what?" "There's a dispute about the north boundary. Your grandfather had a survey done in 1873 that might settle it. The papers are in the storage room." She paused. "Your father hasn't been able to look through them." Evan said nothing. His jaw was tight. "I'm not asking you to go through your grandfather's things," she said. "I'm asking you to go through his papers. There's a difference." "Is there?" "Yes," she said. "His things are his papers are records. Records have a job to do. Right now the job is protecting this ranch." He looked at the floor of the barn. She could see him working through it, the specific internal negotiation of a boy who didn't want to feel anything and also couldn't ignore a practical argument made directly. "What does the document look like?" he asked. "A survey map. Probably rolled or folded. Your grandfather would have treated it as an important record, so it's likely somewhere deliberate, not buried." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said without looking at her, "I'll look." "Thank you," she said. She turned to go, "Miss Whitmore." She turned back. He was still looking at the barn floor. Was the cornbread yesterday different? There was something in it. She'd added a small amount of cracklings to the second batch pork cracklings from the fat she'd been rendering, stirred into the batter at the last minute. A small thing. She'd almost left them out because she wasn't sure how the household felt about variations. Crackling, she said, if you didn't like it. I liked it, he said quickly. Then, as though regretting the speed of it, it was fine. She went back to the kitchen. She didn't smile until she was around the corner of the barn and out of his sight. He found the survey map 2 days later. She was in the kitchen when she heard his feet on the stairs faster than usual, a sound that had a different quality than his normal reluctant descent, and he came through the kitchen door with a rolled document held carefully in both hands, and he laid it on the kitchen table with the focused intensity of someone who has just done something real and knows it. It's the right one, he said. 1873. The boundary marks are on the north slope, exactly where Papa said they were. There's a stone marker referenced here. I went out this morning to check, and it's still there. Mara set down the bread she was shaping and came to the table. She looked at the map. His finger traced the boundary line. She followed it. You went out this morning? She said. In the cold? It wasn't that cold. It had been 15 degrees and he'd been out at first light. She chose not to say anything about this. Your father needs to see this today, she said. I know. He was still looking at the map, but something in his face had changed some minor significant adjustment, like a window that has been shut for a long time and has been opened just a crack. She went to find Hawthorne. Later that afternoon, watching from the kitchen window as Hawthorne and Evan stood together at the fence rail going over the map side by side, Evan pointing, Hawthorne listening, both of them in the specific posture of people working on the same problem, she turned back to the stove and adjusted the heat under the pot that didn't need adjusting. Some things you didn't look at directly. You just let them happen, and you kept your hands busy, and you were grateful in a quiet way that had nothing to do with anyone else and didn't require acknowledgement. The soup was lamb with barley. She'd managed to trade 2 of her apple pies with a farm woman in town for a proper lamb shoulder, a transaction that had taken 10 minutes and left both of them satisfied. The barley made it thick. The smell of it filled the kitchen and moved through the house in the way that good food moved through houses, not dramatically, just steadily, the way warmth moved, reaching into corners that had been cold. That evening at supper, Evan passed the bread to Chester before Chester had to ask for it. Chester looked mildly startled. Then he said, "Thank you, son," and took a piece. And the table continued as it always continued, men eating. Boots under the table. The dog at the door because it had figured out that the door was the warmest spot, and Mara brought the pot to the table and served soup and said nothing about boundary maps or survey markers or 13-year-old boys who got up at first light in 15-degree weather to check stone markers in the north pasture. She noted it, though. She noted all of it. By the end of the 3rd week, the men were eating well enough that their afternoon work had materially improved. Hawthorne had mentioned it a second time, less indirectly. She'd accepted the information, the same way she accepted all practical information about the ranch, as data relevant to her job, which was to keep the people in this house and on this land fed and functional. What she hadn't expected, and what she had not yet fully accounted for in any internal ledger, was what it felt like to come downstairs in the dark every morning and build the kitchen fire, and know that by the time the day was done she would have fed a family and kept a household running and solved whatever new problem the day put in front of her. She hadn't expected it to feel like what it felt like. She'd thought it would feel like work. It did feel like work. But underneath the work was something else, something she didn't have a clean name for, something adjacent to the word belonging, but not so bold as that. Not yet. She was new here. She knew she was new here. Still, when the fire took and the kitchen began to warm and she could hear, upstairs, the sounds of a household beginning to wake, footsteps, a door, Nora's voice asking something, a man's low reply, she didn't feel like someone passing through. She felt in some specific and cautious way, like someone who had started to know where things were. The north boundary papers were in Hawthorne's desk now, documented and ready. The survey map had been copied and the copy sent to the land office in Caleb's name, with a detailed written description of the stone marker that Evan had verified in person. The dispute wasn't finished. These things never finished quickly, but the ground they were standing on was solid, and Elias Crow's argument had lost its most important leverage. She knew it wasn't over. A man like Crow, who had already shown he preferred reshaping the story to telling it he didn't simply put down a grievance when it stopped working. He found a new angle. She knew that. She kept it, like the pantry inventory, in the practical part of her mind where things were noted and tracked and not worried about until they needed action. In the meantime, there was supper to plan for 14 men and 2 children, and a man who was beginning slowly, with the specific carefulness of someone who had been hurt before, and knew it to look across the table at her with an expression she recognized, but was not yet ready to name. She didn't look back. Not yet. She kept her hands in the work, and she kept her eyes on the kitchen, and she let the ranch do what ranches do when they're fed, and running it moved forward, day by day, in the direction of something that had not yet been decided but was already becoming real. The land office's response arrived on a Thursday, which Mara knew because Thursday was the day she baked the molasses bread she'd moved it from. Friday, after Chester mentioned, offhandedly, that Thursday was the day the men typically rode the longest fence line. She'd adjusted without announcing the adjustment, and she was pulling the second loaf from the oven when she heard the wagon come in fast, and Hawthorne's boots on the porch steps with a weight that was different from his usual step. He came through the kitchen on his way to the desk room. He had a letter in his hand. Bad, she asked. He stopped. He looked at the letter, then at her. They've agreed to hear Crow's case formally. County commissioners, 3 weeks. She set the loaf on the cooling rack. Does the survey map hold? It should. But Crow's lawyer is arguing that the stone markers were placed after the original boundary was drawn, that my father moved them. He said this last part with a flatness that told her how much effort it was taking to say it flatly. He's calling my father a fraud. The kitchen was quiet for a moment except for the ticking of the cooling bread. Your father's been dead for 6 years, she said, which is convenient for the argument. She looked at Hawthorne's face, at the specific tightening around the jaw that she'd come to recognize as the outer edge of something he didn't let go further than that. He was a man who had learned to contain things, probably starting young, probably out of necessity, probably reinforced by the kind of life that required you to keep moving regardless of what happened. She recognized this quality because she had it herself. Then we build the case, she said. What else is there? Does anyone remember the 1,873 survey being done? Is there a witness still living who was there? He was quiet for a moment. Old Aldrich at the general store, his father, was the one who sold my father the original parcel. He might remember something. Talk to him, she said. Not as a favor, as a fact witness. He looked at her. You make it sound straightforward. It isn't, she said. But the alternative is standing still and hoping Crow runs out of money for his lawyer, and I don't think he will. She turned back to the stove. Eat something before you go back out. There's soup and the bread's cooling. He ate. He didn't say anything more about it. She watched him from the corner of her eye while she worked the way he held the spoon, the quality of the silence around him, and she thought that a man carrying that particular kind of anger, the kind that came from someone dirtying a dead man's name, needed practical work more than he needed comfort. He needed something to do. She was glad she'd given him something to do. When he left, Nora appeared in the kitchen doorway with the inevitability of a child who has been listening from the stairs. Is Pop in trouble, she asked. He has a problem, Mara said. Problems have solutions. We're looking for the solution. What if there isn't one? Mara thought about how to answer this honestly without terrifying her. There's always something that can be done, she said. Sometimes it's what you expected. Sometimes it's something you didn't think of until you had to. She looked at Nora. Your grandfather did everything right with that land. That matters. Nora came into the kitchen and sat at the table. She didn't say anything else, but she stayed there while Mara worked, which was its own kind of answer. The thing about the 4th week that Mara hadn't anticipated was Elias Crow coming to the ranch. He didn't send notice. He arrived on a Wednesday afternoon while Hawthorne was out with the hands checking the northern fence, which she suspected was not a coincidence. 2 horses at the gate, him and one of his men, and he came to the front door and knocked. She answered it because she was the one in the house. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't immediately classify. Not hostile, not apologetic either. Something more calculated than either. Miss Whitmore, he said. I'd hoped to speak with Hawthorne. He's not here, she said. She did not invite him in. I see. He paused. His man sat the horse a respectful distance back and looked at the middle distance. I came to make an offer, Crow said. Directly, if Hawthorne's willing to listen. I don't want this to go to the commissioners. I think it can be resolved between us privately. Then send a letter, she said. I wanted it to be a conversation. Mr. Hawthorne decides who he has conversations with, she said. That's not my decision. You can write to him, or you can come back when he's here. Those are the options. Crow's expression shifted. Something crossed his face that was related to frustration but dressed as patience. I want you to understand, he said, lowering his voice slightly, as though this were a confidence, that the dispute about the land isn't personal. It's a matter of record, the boundary as I understand it. Mr. Crow, she said, I'm going to stop you there. You chose to come to this property while the owner was away and speak to his household manager about a legal dispute. I'm not going to have that conversation. If you want to make an offer, make it to Hawthorne in writing. She held his gaze. Have a safe ride back. She closed the door. She stood in the hallway for a moment and listened to the horses leave. Her heart was beating faster than the moment called, for she noticed that, registered it as information. He made her angry in a way she hadn't fully allowed herself to feel until this moment. Not because of the platform, she was genuinely past the platform, but because of the specific quality of this, the way he kept moving, kept pressing, kept trying to reshape everything around him so that he came out as something other than what he was. She went back to the kitchen and finished what she'd been doing, which was starting a stock from the soup bones she'd been saving. It was the kind of work that required patience and low heat and periodic attention, and the rhythm of it helped her put the anger back in its proper compartment where it would be available when useful but wouldn't bleed into everything else. Hawthorne came home at dusk. She told him about the visit while she served supper. She wasn't going to let it sit, and she wasn't going to wait until the children were asleep to raise it, because Evan needed to know the kind of man they were dealing with, and he was old enough to hear it stated plainly. Hawthorne's face went through several things while she described it. He settled on a still, careful expression that she associated with the outermost edge of controlled anger. "He came here while I was out," he said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes, and you told him to write to me." "I did." Evan was watching from across the table, with the focused attention of a boy who had learned that the conversations worth understanding were the ones adults had while pretending children weren't fully present. "He won't write," Hawthorne said. "If he wanted to make a real offer, he'd have come when I was here." "I know," she said. "He wanted to see what the situation was. Whether you'd left me with any instructions about dealing with him. Whether there was an angle, was there?" "No," she said. "But now he knows there isn't." She served Nora's soup. She refilled Tommy's coffee. The supper went on in the usual way, and the conversation moved to other things: the fence, the weather, Chester's assessment that the temperature was about to drop significantly by the end of the week. But Mara noticed, twice during the meal, Evan looking across the table at her with something that was not quite any of the things he'd looked at her with before. It took her a moment to identify it. It was something close to respect. She didn't acknowledge it. She cleared plates and went to the kitchen and let it be what it was. Chester's prediction about the weather was not wrong. It was, if anything, insufficient. The first indication was the sky on Friday morning, a specific quality of gray that was different from ordinary winter gray, lower and more solid, the kind of sky that felt like a ceiling rather than a distance. The second indication was the wind, which shifted direction sometime before noon and began coming from the northwest with a steadiness that had intent in it. By Friday afternoon, every man on the Double C knew what was coming. Hawthorne rode the property twice, checking fences, counting cattle, making decisions about where the herds needed to be, and which of the outbuildings needed additional securing. The men worked through the afternoon with the particular focus of people who understood that the work they did in the next 6 hours would determine how the next several days went. Mara had known something was coming since she'd opened the kitchen door that morning, and felt the specific quality of the cold denser than usual, more purposeful. She'd gone straight to her inventory. What she had: flour, reasonable. Lard, adequate. Beans. A full 20 pounds of dried she'd stocked heavy after the first supply run because she had a suspicion about Wyoming winters, and her suspicion had been conservative. Salt pork, a good side and a half. Cornmeal, molasses. Coffee, a concern she had enough for 4 days at normal use, which meant she'd need to ration it early rather than run out suddenly. Root vegetables from the cellar. She sent Nora down with a lantern to take a full count. Bread from this morning's batch. The stock she'd started on Wednesday and finished yesterday, 8 quarts in the cold pantry. What she didn't have enough of: fresh meat. Time. She spent the afternoon making soup, 2 pots, running simultaneously, the largest pots she had. She made biscuit dough and held it in the cold pantry, because biscuits baked fresh were better than biscuits held, but dough could wait and oven time couldn't. She started a 3rd pot with beans, because beans could cook long and low and didn't require attention, and she needed her attention on the other things. Tommy Birch appeared at the kitchen door at 4 in the afternoon, with frost already in his hair, and an expression that was trying not to be frightened and mostly succeeding. "Mr. Hawthorne says it'll hit tonight," he said. "Could be a day. Could be 2. Could be 3, she said. "Go eat something before it does. There's soup in the first pot, help yourself." He stared at her. "You're already ready." "I'll be ready," she said. "There's a difference. Go eat." He ate. 3 other hands came through in the next hour, and she fed all of them from the pot and kept it going, adding water and a handful of dried herbs from the back shelf when it got low, because she'd learned in the first week that the best way to manage food for a large and unpredictable number of people was to have a pot that never fully emptied. The blizzard hit at 9 that night. It didn't arrive gradually. It arrived the way serious things arrive all at once, with a complete commitment. The wind went from steady to something that felt structural. like a force that was pressing against the house with the intention of testing whether it would hold. The temperature dropped 12 degrees in 2 hours. Snow came horizontal, which meant visibility at the windows was effectively zero within the first 30 minutes. Mara was in the kitchen when it hit, and she stayed there. Hawthorne came in from outside at 9:30 covered in snow to the point where she had to look twice to confirm it was him. He stomped his boots at the door and pulled off his coat, and his face was red from cold in a way that looked painful. 6 men in the bunkhouse, he said without preamble. 4 with me and Tommy and Evan, and the Evan is out there? She said. He wouldn't stay in. We were checking the south cattle, he was with me. He looked at her. He's fine. He's with Pete Garber at the barn. She turned back to the stove and adjusted the heat under the second pot. Her hands were steady. She made them stay steady. I need coffee out to the bunkhouse, Hawthorne said. And food if possible. The men who are staying out near the south herd are going to be working through the night. I know, she said. How cold is it? Cold enough that if the cattle bunch against the south fence, we could lose some. She thought quickly. Can you move them? We've been trying. The wind's against us. She made decisions in the same way she made all decisions rapidly and without drama. She filled the largest pot with soup, the first pot, the fuller one, and she wrapped it in the heaviest cloth she had, and she called for Tommy, who was in the dining room, and she told him what she needed carried, and in what order, and where it was going. He nodded and went out into the wind without being told twice, because Tommy Birch had learned in the past weeks that when Mara Whitmore gave instructions in that particular tone, the instructions were the right ones. She had biscuits in the oven within 20 minutes. She had coffee in every vessel that could hold it. She organized the kitchen into something that was less kitchen and more field station, the table cleared of everything at working space, the stove running at full capacity, the lamp turned up to maximum, everything she would need in the next several hours within arm's reach so she wouldn't have to search. Nora appeared at the top of the kitchen stairs in her nightgown, with her coat thrown over it and her hair loose. Go back to bed, Mara said. I want to help. Mara looked at her. 9 years old, barefoot on the cold floor, chin up with the specific stubbornness that Mara had come to recognize as the girl's version of courage. Put your shoes on first, Mara said, then come back. Nora ran. She was back in 3 minutes, with shoes and her mother's oversized coat and a look on her face that said she understood this was real and she was going to do her part in it. Can you cut bread? Mara asked. Yes, then cut bread. Even slices. As many as the loaves give you. Then wrap each set of 4 in cloth. There's a stack of clean cloths on the second shelf. Nora went to work. She cut bread with the careful, slightly uneven cuts of a child who was concentrating hard, and the slices weren't perfect, but they were even enough. And she wrapped them in cloth with a seriousness that made Mara's chest ache in a specific way she didn't examine. The night went on in that rhythm for the next 4 hours. Hawthorne came in and out, each time colder, each time reporting something new the south herd was holding. The north fence had taken some damage, but nothing catastrophic. 2 men were showing early signs of the cold that you needed to move them inside before it became real trouble. She had soup and heat and dry space ready each time. She fed whoever came in, got them warm enough to go back out if they needed to, held the kitchen steady as the center the rest of the house organized around. At 1 in the morning, Evan came in. He was with Pete Garber, and Pete was holding his right arm in a way that said something had happened to it. Not dramatic, not broken, but wrong. He'd been knocked by a panicked animal in the barn, and his wrist was swollen at the joint. Sit, Mara said to Pete, and she brought a cloth she'd been keeping in the cold pantry. She'd thought of it 2 hours ago. Because cold injuries and heat injuries both needed temperature management, and she'd wanted it ready. And she wrapped his wrist with the efficiency of someone who had done this before, not with the hands of a trained physician, but with the competent hands of someone who understood that injuries left untreated in cold weather became larger problems. Pete watched her work. Where'd you learn that? He said. My uncle's store, she said. We had a supply accident once. His hand swelled like a melon. Trial and error. Did he keep the hand? He kept the hand. Pete's expression shifted into something that was mostly relief. Evan stood in the corner of the kitchen with his coat still on and his face still raw from the cold, and he watched her wrap Pete's wrist, and he didn't say anything. After Pete had been settled at the table with soup and coffee and instructions not to move the wrist for at least an hour, Evan said quietly, There are 3 calves in the barn that are going to freeze if we don't get heat to them. Papa's trying to get a lamp set up, but the wind keeps. What do you need? She said. He looked at her. Extra lamps if you have them. And anything you can spare for insulation, old blankets, cloth sacks, anything. She went to the storage room off the back hall. She'd been in there twice and knew what was in it, and she found 2 extra lanterns in the stack of old wool blankets she'd noted on her second day and had filed away as potentially useful for. Exactly the kind of situation that didn't look urgent until it was. She brought them back to the kitchen and added 2 sealed tins of lamp oil from the shelf. Evan took them without being told twice. He looked at her once more at the door, not the waiting look, not the suspicious look, but something more direct than either. "Thank," he said. He went back out into the wind. She went back to the stove. The blizzard held for 31 hours. Not 2 days, as Chester had suggested it might, not 3. 31 hours from the first hard gust to the moment the wind eased and the snow shifted from horizontal to vertical, and you could see past the kitchen window again. 31 hours during which Mara did not sleep, and did not sit down for longer than the time it took to eat a bowl of soup standing at the counter, because there was always something on the stove that needed watching, and always someone coming in from the cold who needed feeding. By the second morning, the kitchen had become the uncontested center of the Double C. This was not a thing Mara had planned. It was a thing that happened the way most real things happen, through accumulation rather than design. The men came in for warmth and food, and they stayed longer than necessary because the kitchen was the warmest room, and because there was always something to eat, and because Mara ran it with a competent efficiency that made people feel, irrationally but genuinely, that things were being managed. Hawthorne conducted 2 conversations about the herd and the fencing at the kitchen table, because that was where the men who needed to be in those conversations were. Nora slept for 4 hours on the bench seat by the back wall, with her coat pulled over her, and Mara let her sleep and worked around her without waking her. The 3rd pot of soup was running by Saturday morning. She'd shifted to beans as the base because the salt pork was running low, and beans gave more yield per pound than anything else she had. And she stretched it with the last of the root vegetables from the cellar, and a ham bone she'd been saving for exactly this kind of situation, had set it aside in the cold pantry in the first week, wrapped in cloth, with the specific foresight of someone who had learned to think in terms of emergencies before they arrived. It wasn't elegant food. It was the right food. At one point during the second morning, Red Garber Pete's brother, a large, quiet man who rarely said much, came into the kitchen for his 3rd cup of coffee, and stood at the counter and looked at Mara working and said, without any particular ceremony, "Ma'am, I've been on 6 ranches in 15 years, and I never saw anything like what you've run here the last 2 days." She didn't look up from what she was doing. "It's soup," she said. "And biscuits." "It's more than that," Red said. She didn't respond to that, but she heard it. When the wind stopped and the sky cleared to that particular sharp winter blue that only came after a storm had finished, Mara went outside for the first time in 31 hours. The cold was serious, the kind that got into the bones before you knew it was there, but the sun was up, and the light on the snow was bright enough to make her eyes water. She stood at the back of the house with a cup of coffee, and let the cold and the quiet and the light do what they needed to do. Everything hurt in small ways, her lower back from standing, her hands from the constant wet and heat of kitchen work, her eyes from the lamplight and the concentration. She was tired in a specific structural way, not the tiredness of poor sleep, but the tiredness of having used herself completely, which was different, and she'd always thought cleaner. She heard the door behind her and turned. Hawthorne. He looked the way she felt, used, wrung out, functional. He had a cup in his hand, and he came to stand beside her and looked at the same white landscape she was looking at. For a while, neither of them said anything. 3 calves made it, he said, the ones Evan was watching. "I know," she said. "He told me this morning. We lost 2 head on the North Line. It could have been worse." He paused. "It would have been worse." She drank her coffee. The cold pressed in around her coat, but the sun on her face was something. "I need to tell you something," Hawthorne said. She waited. "When I walked across that platform to speak to you, he said I was looking for a cook. That's the honest truth of it. I had a problem, and you were standing near the problem, and the timing seemed I wasn't thinking past the immediate situation." She said nothing. "But I need you to know," he said, "that what you've done here, what you did this past day and a half, that's not something I can put a $12 wage on. And I know that's not why you did it. I know you did it because it needed doing. But I wanted you to know that I see it. I see all of it." She looked out at the snow. She was not someone who cried easily. She'd managed to get through 31 hours of the hardest work she'd done in years without crying. But there was something about the specific quality of being seen, after a long period of operating effectively and being appreciated only through practical evidence, that did something to her she wasn't entirely prepared for. She didn't cry. She pressed her lips together and waited 1 beat and then said, "The North Boundary hearing is in 2 weeks. He was quiet for a moment, accepting the redirect. "Yes, then we focus on that." She turned to go back inside. "Mara," he said. She stopped. He'd used her given name twice before, both times in the functional urgency of the storms, and this was different. This was deliberate. She turned. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had more to say and was making a decision about whether now was the time. She watched him make the decision. 2 weeks, he said. "We'll focus on the hearing." She nodded. She went inside. She stood at the kitchen door for a moment before going back to the stove. Her heart was doing something inconvenient. She noted it, set it aside, and went to check on the beans. What happened next arrived with a different kind of force than the blizzard quieter, more deliberately aimed. 3 days after the storm cleared, Tommy came back from a supply run to town with the provisions she'd asked for, an expression he was working very hard to keep neutral. She saw it the moment he came through the kitchen door. "Say it," she said. He set down the supply sacks. He looked at his boots for a moment. Crow's been telling people that the storm would have killed half the Double C's herd if his land dispute had been settled earlier. Says the northern pasture access is what made the difference, and that Hawthorne's people were only out there because of a boundary that isn't rightfully his. He paused. "And he's saying other things. About you." She turned down the heat under the pot. "What things?" "That you and Hawthorne, that your being here isn't what it looks like." Tommy met her eyes and then looked away again, which told her everything about the specific nature of what was being said. She stood with her hands flat on the work table. She was not surprised. She had known this was coming, had known it the day Crow appeared at the gate while Hawthorne was out. Had understood then that a man who couldn't win through land records would look for another angle. She had known what the angle would be, because it was the oldest angle available against a woman who had put herself in an unconventional situation and done well in it. She was still angry. Knowing something is coming doesn't make it not hit. "He's filing a formal complaint with the county commissioners," Tommy said, combining it with the land case. He's saying that your presence at the Double C is evidence of a disreputable arrangement, and that Hawthorne's claim to the land should be reviewed in light of his character." The kitchen was quiet. She thought about every morning she'd come downstairs before dawn and built the kitchen fire. She thought about Pete Garber's wrist and the 3 calves in the barn and the 31 hours that had cost her in ways she was still feeling in her lower back and her hands. She thought about Nora cutting bread at midnight, serious face doing her part. She thought about Evan finding the survey map in the cold pre-dawn and running across the frozen field to check a stone marker. She thought about what Elias Crow was trying to do to all of that. The anger settled in her chest into something harder and more useful than heat. "Tommy," she said, "go tell Hawthorne, tell him everything you told me, and ask him to come here when he's ready." Tommy went. She turned back to the stove and kept working, because the soup didn't stop needing attention, because someone had tried to destroy what she'd spent 6 weeks building. Hawthorne came in 20 minutes later. His face told her Tommy had been thorough. "I'm going to the commissioners directly," he said. "Today if I can get a horse saddled." "No," she said. He stopped. "Not today," she said. Not angry. Angry men walking into formal hearings hand Crow exactly what he wants and a scene, a display. Something that looks like defensiveness. She turned from the stove. "We need witnesses. We need people who can speak to what's actually happening at this ranch. And we need them not because we're asking favors, but because they know the truth, and they're willing to say so." He looked at her. "Who?" she thought. "Tommy, Red and Pete, Chester. The Aldrich boy from the general store. You said he respected his father's business dealings with yours. That means he respects the land records. The woman at the market who took my pies in trade, her name is Mrs. Brower, and she told me 3 things in 10 minutes that told me she was a woman who said what she meant." And she paused. "Evan." Hawthorne went still. "Evan is 13. Evan is the person who found the survey map and verified the stone marker in 15-degree weather before anyone asked him to," she said. "He's not a child in the way Crow will assume he is. He's a witness with specific, documented, verifiable knowledge." She held Hawthorne's gaze. "Let him stand for his grandfather's name. He needs to." Hawthorne was quiet for a long time. She didn't try to fill the silence. "You've thought about all of this," he said, "before today." "I've thought about it since the day Crow came to this gate while you were out," she said. "A man who tries to go around you rather than to you isn't going to stop until someone makes stopping less profitable than continuing." She paused. "We're going to make it a great deal less profitable." He looked at her with an expression she'd been careful not to name for the past 6 weeks. She looked back at him steadily. "All right," he said. "Good." She turned to the stove. "Eat first, then we plan. You can't think properly when you're running on cold coffee and anger." He sat down at the kitchen table. She served him soup and bread, and she stood at the counter and ate her own soup, and they went through the plan systematically: who would be contacted, what needed to be said, in what order the hearing would need to be approached. She had already been organizing it in her head during the 20 minutes it had taken for Tommy to find him, and what came out now was not rough thinking but a structure. He listened. He asked questions. He suggested 2 names she hadn't thought of: a county recorder named Harris, who had processed the 1,873 document and was still in his position, and a cattle buyer named Duggan, who had done business with Caleb's father and knew the northern land from professional necessity. By the time they'd finished eating, they had a plan. It wasn't a certain plan. Nothing was certain. Crow still had money and a lawyer and the specific advantage of being the one who had forced the situation. But they had something that Crow had consistently underestimated from the beginning. They had what was actually true, documented and witnessed and defended by people who had seen it with their own eyes. And they had 2 weeks to make sure the truth could stand up in a room. She cleared the bowls and went back to her list, the household list this time, the practical inventory, because the storm had drawn down the store significantly, and she needed to calculate the resupply order before Saturday's wagon run. The work was always there. The work didn't care about land disputes or reputations or the specific difficulty of standing in a room and being accused of things you hadn't done. She worked. Outside, the snow lay white and still under the cold blue sky, and the double C stood in its usual sprawl of fence and outbuilding and frozen ground, looking exactly like what it was, a working ranch that had just survived something serious and was already moving toward the next thing. She pulled the afternoon's bread from the oven. She set it on the rack. She listened to it settle and tick as it cooled. The hearing was in 11 days. She had 11 days, and she had the truth, and she had the specific, worn-in knowledge of what she was capable of when the situation required it. That would have to be enough. And she was fairly certain, in the careful, unromantic way she was certain about most things, that it was. The 11 days between the plan and the hearing were the kind of days that didn't feel like 11. They felt like a compression of time, too much happening in too small a container, everything slightly too loud, too consequential. The ordinary work of the ranch continuing in parallel with the other work, the work that had no ledger entry. Hawthorne rode to see Aldrich on the Monday. He rode to see County Recorder Harris on the Tuesday, which was a longer trip requiring an overnight in town, and Mara kept the household running and didn't mention that she'd noticed he'd taken his good coat. Tommy Birch went to find cattle buyer Duggan on the Wednesday and came back with confirmation that Duggan remembered the northern land clearly and would say so in a formal setting, which was more than they'd hoped for and slightly more than Tommy had expected, judging by the look on his face when he reported back. Evan was the conversation Hawthorne had finally agreed to have, and Mara was not in the room when he had it. She was in the kitchen. She heard their voices from the study, not the words, just the register of them. Hawthorne's measured and deliberate, Evan's starting terse and then shifting to something more sustained. It went on for 40 minutes. When Evan came through the kitchen afterward, he didn't look at her directly, but he stopped at the counter and picked up an apple from the bowl she kept there and said, without particular inflection, "Papa says I'll speak about the stone marker." "Yes," she said. "He says it'll be a formal room. Commissioners. 3 of them," she said. "You'll say what you found, how you found it, what you saw when you checked it against the map. Just that, nothing more, nothing less." He turned the apple in his hand. "What if they try to say I misread the map? Did you?" Pause. "No. Then say that," she said, clearly and without apology. He bit into the apple. He looked out the kitchen window at the frozen yard. He called grandfather a fraud, he said. Not a question. Not exactly a statement, either, more like something he was trying the weight of by saying it aloud. "He did," Mara said. That's the part that he stopped. "I know," she said. She didn't try to finish the sentence for him or smooth it over. Some things were just what they were. Evan ate the apple and set the core on the counter with the deliberateness of someone who has made a decision but isn't ready to announce it, and he went back upstairs. She put the core in the compost and went back to her work. Mrs. Brower came to the ranch on the Thursday, not because Mara had sent for her, but because word had reached her through the small, efficient network of women in Coulter's Creek who knew what was happening in most households, whether or not they'd been told directly. She arrived in a wagon driven by her son, a solid, quiet boy of about 15, and she knocked at the kitchen door rather than the front, which immediately told Mara something about her. She was a wide-shouldered woman in her late 50s with rough hands and the direct manner of someone who had been making practical decisions for long enough that social formality felt like time wasted. "I heard what he's saying about you," she said before she'd fully stepped inside. "I've been in this county 22 years, and I know what it looks like when a man is lying to save himself embarrassment, and I know what it looks like when a woman is being accused of something because there's no other way to make her look small." She looked at Mara steadily. "I'll speak at the hearing." Mara looked at her for a moment. "You don't know me well," she said. "I know your pies, Mrs. Brower said. "I know you trade fair and keep your word, and you don't waste. And I know Elias Crow left a woman stranded on a public platform and then had the gall to start telling stories about her after she found her own way." She paused. "That's enough for me." Mara stepped back to let her in. She made coffee. They sat at the kitchen table, Mrs. Brower and Mara and eventually Nora, who appeared from somewhere, and sat at the far end of the table with a book she was not reading. And they talked through what the hearing would look like and what Mrs. Brower was willing to say, and how to say it so that it was useful rather than merely supportive. Mrs. Brower was, as Mara had assessed from the beginning, a woman who said what she meant. This was both valuable and slightly difficult to manage, because what she meant sometimes had edges that needed to be blunted for a formal setting. They worked through it carefully, and by the end of the hour they had something that would hold up. When she left, Nora looked up from her unread book. "She likes you," Nora said. "She likes fairness," Mara said. "I just happened to be the occasion." Nora considered this. "Is there a difference?" Mara thought about it honestly. "Not much," she said. The hearing was on a Friday, which meant the Thursday before. It was the longest night Mara had spent in the house so far, not for lack of sleep, because she was tired enough to sleep, but for the quality of the wakefulness before sleep arrived. She lay in her room with the window showing the particular darkness of a Wyoming winter night. No moon, just stars hard and close, and she thought through everything the way she always thought through things. Before they happened, not worrying, exactly, but accounting, running the inventory of what they had and what they'd prepared and where the gaps were. The gaps were real. Crow had a lawyer, and they did not. Hawthorne had decided against it, partly for cost, and partly because he felt that a lawyer suggested something to defend rather than something to state, and Mara had agreed with the logic while reserving judgment about the outcome. Crow had been in this county for a decade and had relationships she didn't fully understand. The commissioners were men she'd never met. What they had was the survey map, the stone marker, Evan's testimony, Duggan's professional knowledge, Harris's records, Aldrich's memory of his father's dealings, Mrs. Brower and two others, a ranch hand named Oliver, who had worked the Double C briefly 2 summers ago and knew the North pasture from direct experience, and a young woman named Clara Prentice, the wife of a grain seller, who had been present on the train platform the day Mara arrived, and had apparently not forgotten what she'd witnessed. 12 people in total were willing to stand and say what they knew. Mara had not counted on 12, she'd hoped for 6. The discrepancy between what she'd hoped for and what they had didn't make her relax. She'd learned too young to relax before things were finished, but it settled something in her chest that had been sitting uneasy for 11 days. She got up an hour before the household, as she always did. She built the kitchen fire. She made coffee. She started breakfast. By the time the boots on the stairs began, Chester first, then Tommy, then the others in their usual sequence, she had eggs and salt pork and cornbread on the table, and the specific normalcies of a working morning that was, she understood, not entirely normal. Hawthorne came down last. He was wearing his good coat again, and he'd shaved clean, and he looked at the kitchen and then at Mara. "You didn't have to do all this," he said. "Not today. People need to eat before formal proceedings," she said, "especially people who are going to have to stand in a room and think clearly." "Sit down." He sat. He ate. He didn't talk much, which was normal for him before difficult things. She understood this and didn't push. Evan came down in his one good shirt, the collar slightly wrong, and Mara straightened it without asking, while she was passing behind him to refill the coffee, and he let her do it without comment, which 6 weeks ago would have been unimaginable. Nora wanted to come. She made this case to her father during breakfast, clearly, and with the specific logic of a child who has rehearsed the argument. "I know what the kitchen is like," she said. "I know what Mara does every day. I was there in the blizzard. I should be there." Hawthorne looked at her for a long moment. Mara said nothing. This was not her decision. "You can come," he said. "But you sit and you stay quiet." Nora sat up very straight. "I will," she said. The county commissioner's meeting room was in the back of the courthouse building, which was Coulter's Creek's one genuinely solid structure, stone-walled and high-ceilinged and cold in the specific, official way of rooms that were heated just enough to make them functional, but not enough to make them comfortable. 3 commissioners sat at a long table at the front. The room had 12 rows of wooden benches, and by the time Mara and Hawthorne and the children arrived, the front half of those benches was already well occupied. She had not anticipated the size of the audience. She saw Elias Crow and his lawyer at a table to the left. Crow was dressed in his best, which she noted was slightly too well dressed for a county, preceding the calculation visible in it, the performance. His lawyer was a thin man with a sheaf of papers that he was already organizing with a deliberateness meant to be observed. She sat in the front row on the right side, Hawthorne beside her, Evan and Nora beside him. Behind them she could hear people settling more than she'd expected, more than Crow had probably expected, given the slight shift she noticed in his posture when the room filled behind the Double C party. Mrs. Brower sat directly behind Mara. She had come in her clean wool coat and her best hat, and she sat with the absolute stillness of someone who intended to be there and was not going to be unsettled by the occasion. Tommy Birch was 3 rows back, boots polished for the first time since Mara had known him. Chester was there. Red Garber. Oliver and Clara Prentice and Duggan and Aldrich and Harris and two more that she hadn't organized but who had apparently organized themselves. The head commissioner, a broad man named Hartley with white side whiskers, and the expression of someone who had sat through a great many proceedings and expected this one to be difficult, called the room to order. What followed was not fast and it was not clean, because formal hearings never were. Crow's lawyer spoke first, and he was good she gave him that. He was skilled with language and with the particular art of making reasonable things sound suspicious, and suspicious things sound inevitable. He laid out the land argument first, which was his stronger ground, and he was careful about it. He didn't call Hawthorne's father a fraud outright. He implied it through the architecture of language, through the careful phrase inconsistencies in the original placement, and the careful phrase subsequent alterations that suggested without stating. Hawthorne's jaw was tight beside her. She pressed her knee briefly against his not tender, just a physical anchor, and felt him take a breath. Then the lawyer moved to the second part of his argument, which was the part Mara had been waiting for, and which she had been correct about. He was smooth about it. He framed it as character evidence that the circumstances at the Double C Ranch suggested a household operating outside the standards of respectability, that the presence of an unmarried woman in an intimate domestic role raised questions about the judgment and character of Caleb Hawthorne, and that such questions were relevant to a formal assessment of his reliability as a land claimant. The room shifted. Not dramatically, a few people adjusted in their seats, a murmur that moved through the benches like a wave and then subsided. Mara kept her face still and her hands folded in her lap. She had thought she was prepared for this moment, had rehearsed it in the 11 days since she'd known it was coming. She found now that preparation and experience were two different things. The sound of it, the formal, procedural sound of her life being characterized in a room full of strangers, was its own specific sensation. She got through it by looking at the survey map laid on the table in front of Hawthorne, focusing on the clean lines of it, the documented reality of it. Commissioner Hartley asked for the response. Hawthorne had agreed to speak first, and he did. He was not a man built for formal language, she knew that, and he didn't try to be. He spoke the way he spoke in the kitchen and on the ranch, directly, with the flatness of someone who understood that the facts were the argument, and the facts didn't need embellishment. He presented the survey map. He presented Harris's records from the county office, which confirmed the 1,873 documentation had been filed legitimately and without amendment. He presented Duggan's written statement about the northern land, which Duggan then stood to confirm in person. Then Evan was called. She watched him stand. He was 13 years old and slight, and his collar was still not entirely right despite her adjustment. And he walked to the front of the room with the stiff, controlled walk of a boy who was frightened and had decided that was not going to matter. Commissioner Hartley looked at him over his spectacles with the measured attention of a man taking a witness's measure. "You're Caleb Hawthorne's son," Hartley said. "Yes, sir. And you found this survey map yourself?" "I did." Evan's voice was steady, a little higher than usual, but steady. "I searched through my grandfather's papers in the storage room of the house. The map was in a leather document tube, labeled with the date and the names of the parties. My grandfather organized his records carefully. And you verified the stone marker yourself?" "Yes, sir. I rode out to the north pasture at first light after I found the map. The marker is still standing where the map shows it. I measured the distance from the fence posts, the same way the survey notes describe it. Everything matches." Crow's lawyer stirred. "I'd like to ask the boy." "The witness," Commissioner Hartley said, without particular emphasis. A small pause. "The witness," the lawyer allowed. "How can we be certain the boy, the witness, is reading the survey accurately?" "This is technical documentation." "He's 13, Evans said. He looked at the lawyer with a directness that Mara suspected had not been expected. "I've been reading my grandfather's documents since I was 9. He kept careful records, and he explained them to me because he said that land was something you had to understand in detail, or you'd lose it to someone who understood it better." He paused. "I understood what I read." The room was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," said Commissioner Hartley. Evan sat down. He looked at the table in front of him. Under the table, very briefly, Nora put her hand on his arm, and he let it stay there for approximately 4 seconds before he shifted, and it fell away. Then the witnesses spoke. Not all of them were asked to speak formally. The process was not set up for 12 people to give testimony, and Commissioner Hartley was managing time carefully. But several were called, and several others were allowed to make brief statements, and each statement did something specific, not dramatic, not emotional in any performed way, but grounded. Oliver spoke about the north pasture boundary from professional knowledge. Harris confirmed the 1,873 filing. Aldrich confirmed his father's dealings with the elder Hawthorne. Mrs. Brower spoke last among the witnesses and she spoke in the manner Mara had helped her prepare: concise, direct, personal. "I've lived in this county for 22 years, she said. "I know what I've seen at the Double C, and I know what I've seen of Miss Whitmore's character over these past weeks. The characterization being put forward in this room does not match anything I have observed, and I've observed considerably." She looked at Crow without particular hostility, just steadily. "The way you look at a fact. That's what I know." Clara Prentice spoke briefly about the day on the platform, not emotionally, not as an accusation, just as a woman who had seen a thing and was reporting it, that she had watched Elias Crow deliver a public rejection to a woman who had traveled across the country on the basis of his promises, and that she had watched that same woman walk away without breaking down and find her own situation. "I thought at the time," Clara said, "that anyone who could do what she did in that moment was not the kind of person who manipulates anyone into anything. I haven't changed my mind." Crow's lawyer objected to this as irrelevant. Commissioner Hartley overruled him on the grounds that the character of all parties was what had been put into question, and the character of all parties was therefore relevant. Crow himself spoke. He was polished, she gave him that too, without generosity. He was a man who could speak well when he needed to, and he needed to now. He maintained the land dispute was legitimate, that the boundary records were genuinely unclear, that he had nothing against anyone at the Double C personally, and only wanted what the law actually provided. He did not look at Mara while he spoke. She looked at him. She kept her hands folded in her lap and her expression neutral, and she looked at him, and she thought about all of it, the 6 letters, the platform, the 15 degrees, and the stone marker, the 31 hours of soup and biscuits and lantern light, and she felt something that was not forgiveness and not hatred either. She felt mostly an enormous clarity. She understood now fully what kind of man he was. Small men were not evil exactly. They were just insufficient for the things they set in motion. The commissioners deliberated for 1 hour and 14 minutes. They came back, and Commissioner Hartley read from a written statement, which told her they had come to a firm rather than contested conclusion. The land dispute was resolved in Hawthorne's favor, the 1,873 survey, and the physical evidence of the stone marker, confirmed by 2 independent witnesses, constituted sufficient documentation of the legitimate boundary. The northern pasture remained part of the Double C. As for the character complaint, dismissed. Commissioner Hartley used the word unfounded twice and professionally managed household once, and his tone while doing so suggested that he found the complaint to have been a waste of the commission's time. Crow's lawyer gathered his papers. Crow sat for a moment at the table before standing, and in that moment, just that one moment, before he recovered himself, she could see what was underneath the polish. A man who had expected this to go differently, a man who had believed his own version of the story so completely that the counter-story had genuinely surprised him. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt tired in the specific way of someone who has been carrying a weight for a sustained period and has just been told she can set it down. She became aware that Hawthorne was looking at her. She looked back at him. He didn't say anything, but he looked at her the way you look at a person you've been through something real with, and she understood, in the manner she understood most things practically, without ornamentation, that the room they'd been in together for the past hour had changed something between them in a way that was going to need to be addressed. Not today, but soon. Behind her, Mrs. Brower patted her once on the shoulder with a firm, dry hand. That was all. It was enough. Tommy Birch, who had been sitting 3 rows back in his polished boots, said something to Red Garber that made Red produce a short, surprised laugh that was immediately muffled. They were still in a courthouse, and the sound of it, ordinary and involuntary and human, cut through the formality of the room like a line of light under a door. Nora put her hand through Mara's arm, not dramatically, just slipped it there, as though this were a thing she'd been doing for years, as though the space between Mara's arm and Since inside were a place that had always been intended for her. Mara looked down at her. Nora was looking at the commissioner's table with a neutral face that was covering something she'd report on later, probably at kitchen breakfast, probably with the careful, considered delivery she used when she wanted to say something that mattered. Evan was already on his feet. He stood beside his father with his chin up and his collar still slightly wrong, and he was not going to admit to anyone in this room that the past hour had cost him something. But she could see it in his jaw, in the set of his shoulders, a slightly different quality of the weight he carried. The same weight, perhaps, but something had shifted in how he held it. Outside, the January light was sharp and cold and honest. The horses were at the rail, and the street was Coulter's Creek, being a small town on a Friday afternoon, and knowing, as small towns knew, that something had been decided in that stone building, and filing the information away for later assessment. Hawthorne signed the commissioner's formal paperwork at the front desk and received the official record copy, which he folded carefully and put in his inside coat pocket with the particular care of a man handling something that represented more than paper. He turned to Mara. "The ranch hands are going to want to hear," he said. "Tommy will tell them before we're halfway home," she said. "Probably started while we were still inside," he agreed. They walked to the wagon. She climbed up onto the bench. Nora sat beside her. Evan rode behind on the smaller horse. He'd insisted on his own horse rather than the wagon, and Hawthorne had agreed, and Mara had said nothing about this because she understood that a 13-year-old who had just stood up in front of county commissioners and held his ground needed the ride home alone. The wagon pulled away from the courthouse rail. The town fell behind. The plains opened up ahead in every direction, white and enormous and indifferent to all human proceedings. Nora, after a mile of silence, she said, "Professionally managed household." "Commissioner Hartley," Mara confirmed. "Is that what you are? A household manager?" Mara considered this, among other things. Nora was quiet for another half-mile. "Then what are the other things?" Mara looked at the road ahead. She thought about the kitchen fire she'd build tomorrow morning, the bread that needed making, the next resupply, the spring work that would come around faster than anyone was ready for. She thought about the stone marker in the north pasture, standing exactly where a careful man had placed it 50 years ago, because he'd understood that you built things to last. "I'm still figuring that out," she said. Nora seemed to find this satisfactory. She leaned slightly against Mara's arm, not dramatically, not with any announcement, and watched the road. Behind them, audible now and then over the wind, came the sound of Evan's horse keeping pace. Hawthorne drove. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said quietly enough that only she could hear over the wind, "I owe you something I don't know how to say properly." "You don't owe me anything," she said. "I was protecting my own situation as much as yours." "No," he said, "you weren't." She looked at the road. She didn't argue. She'd learned that some truths had to be left where they were put. The double C came into view ahead, the main house, the barn, the orderly sprawl of fence and outbuilding, smoke from the bunkhouse chimney. Tommy's horse already at the rail because he'd ridden ahead, just as she'd said. She looked at it, all of it. She had arrived in this county with $62 in one suitcase and a future that had evaporated on a train platform in front of strangers. She had built, in 6 weeks, something she could not have designed from the beginning because she hadn't known yet what was needed or what she was capable of. She knew now. The wagon turned in through the gate, and Hawthorne called a word to the horses, and they slowed. And the double C came up around them the way familiar places came up around you, not arriving exactly, but resuming as though it had been waiting while they were gone. She climbed down from the wagon. She went to the kitchen. She built up the stove, which had been banked low in their absence, and she put water on for coffee. And she stood at the kitchen window and looked at the late afternoon light on the snow, which had the particular quality of light that meant the day was almost done and tomorrow was coming. She heard boots on the porch, then Nora in the kitchen doorway. "Chester wants to know if there's supper," Nora said. "Tell him yes," Mara said. "Tell him an hour." Nora disappeared. Mara turned to the pantry and began pulling what she needed, because there were 14 people to feed, and the day wasn't finished yet, and the work, as always, was exactly where she'd left it. The supper that night was louder than any supper the Double C had produced since Mara arrived. Tommy Birch had indeed told everyone before the wagon was through the gate, and by the time she had the stove running at full capacity, the bunkhouse had produced a level of noise she hadn't heard before, not rowdy, not the noise of men drinking, but the noise of men who had been carrying a shared tension for weeks and had just been released from it. Chester knocked on the kitchen door and asked if there was anything she needed carried, and she put him to work, moving the extra chairs from the storage room, because she had a feeling the dining table was going to be full. Tonight, in a way, it hadn't been since she'd arrived. She was right. All 14 men came to supper. Hawthorne sat at the head of the table, Nora and Evan on either side of him, and then the hands filling in down the length of it until the room was close and warm, and there was barely space to move the serving dishes through. She made the lamb stew she'd been planning for Sunday and moved it to Friday, because some occasions demanded better than what had been scheduled. She made 3 loaves of the molasses bread, which she'd been intending to hold, until the following morning, and she opened the last of the preserved plums she'd been rationing since October, and made a sauce from it that she put on the table in a small bowl, and didn't explain, because it didn't need explaining. It was a thing you served when something had been won. The meal was everything a meal could be in a working ranch house in January. Not elegant, not quiet, occasionally interrupted by Tommy saying something that made Red Garber choke on his bread, but warm and real and sufficient in every way that mattered. Mara ate in the kitchen. This was her habit, and she saw no reason to change it on the basis of a legal victory. She ate at the counter with her bowl and her bread, and she could hear the dining room from where she stood, the voices of men who were fed and comfortable, and she was satisfied in the specific, unshowy way that satisfaction came to people who had done the work themselves and didn't need anyone to name it. She was rinsing her bowl when she heard the dining room quiet, not completely, but measurably, and then Hawthorne's voice, distinct from the others, saying something she couldn't make out, and someone laughed. Then Chester's voice, unmistakable in its particular register. Then another wave of sound. She dried her hands. She went back to the stove. She started the dishes. Later, after the men had gone to the bunkhouse and the children had gone up to bed, and the house had settled into its nighttime self, Hawthorne came to the kitchen. She was finishing the last of the cleanup, wiping down the work table, and she heard him in the doorway and didn't turn around. "You should have eaten with us," he said. "I eat where I work," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "That's going to have to change." She turned around. He was leaning in the doorway with his arms crossed, and he was looking at her with the expression she had been carefully not naming for 6 weeks. And she understood from the quality of it that he was done waiting for a better moment, because he had concluded there was no better moment than this. "Maras," he said. "Caleb," she said. She'd used his given name perhaps 4 times in 6 weeks, always functionally, always in the urgency of something that needed doing. This time it was not functional. He came into the kitchen and stood on the other side of the work table, not close, not distant, just present in the deliberate way of a man who had thought carefully about what he wanted to say, and was now saying it. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to let me say all of it before you respond. Because if I stop in the middle, I'm not sure I'll start again." She set down the cloth. She waited. "When Margaret died," he said, and she understood from the way he said the name that this was a thing he rarely said aloud, that the name had a specific weight from disuse. "I made a decision. Not out loud. Not something I told anyone. But I decided that the ranch was what mattered, and the children were what mattered, and that everything else was finished. I told myself it was practical. I told myself I was being realistic about what one loss does to a life." He paused. "I was wrong about what I was actually doing." She didn't speak. "I was hiding," he said, with the flatness of someone saying a thing they've known for a while, but haven't said yet. "Behind the work, behind the children, behind the legitimacy of all of it, because you can't lose what you don't have. And if I never let anything in again, I'd never have to." He stopped. "You know what I'm saying?" "I know what you're saying," she said. "You walked in here with 1 suitcase and $62 and the most complete absence of self-pity I've ever seen in a person," he said. "And you built something in this house that I didn't know was missing until it was here. And I want to be clear about what I'm saying. I'm not saying I'm grateful for the cook. I'm not saying I've noticed your efficiency." He looked at her steadily. "I'm saying the house became something different when you came into it. I became something different." He stopped again, shorter this time. "You know what you've done for them?" "They did it themselves," she said. "Partly," he said, "because of you." She looked at the table between them. She thought about this moment, the specific shape of it, a kitchen late at night, with the stove ticking as it cooled, and the smell of the evening's cooking still in the air, and a man across a work table telling her something true. She had been careful. She had been careful every day for 6 weeks about the difference between what was real and what was convenience, wearing the costume of something real. She had watched for it. She had asked herself the hard questions: was this a man turning to the nearest available person? Because loneliness will do that. Because grief will do that. Because having someone competent nearby creates a false sense of connection that can look like feeling if you don't examine it closely. She had examined it closely. She'd examined it every time she caught him, looking at her in the way she wouldn't name. She'd examined it during the blizzard, when the work of the crisis had created its own intimacy, and she'd been careful not to read meaning into proximity. She'd examined it during the planning for the hearing, and the hearing itself and the ride home, with Nora's hand through her arm and his voice saying, "I owe you something I don't know how to say." What she had found, each time she examined it, was not the convenient warmth of propinquity. What she found was something more specific and less comfortable, a man who had been watching her the same way she watched everything, with the careful attention of a person who needed to understand what a thing actually was before deciding how to treat it. He had not rushed. He had not made it awkward. He had let her be what she was and done the work of understanding it. It was not gratitude. Gratitude didn't take 6 weeks of watching. "I have conditions," she said. Something in him shifted a breath, a slight release around the eyes. He'd been afraid she was going to give him a different answer first. "Tell me," he said. "I need to know," she said, "that this isn't about what I've done for this household. Because what I've done for this household is my job. I did it because it was my job, and because I'm good at it, and because it needed doing, not as a way of earning my place in a different sense." She paused. "I need to know that you see the difference." "I do," he said. "I see it completely, and I need you to understand," she said, "that I came to Wyoming to build something. I came here with a plan that didn't survive contact with that platform, and I rebuilt it on different terms, and I am not looking for someone to save me from the outcome. I don't need saving. No, he said, you don't. Then what are you offering, she said, not hostile, genuinely asking, because she was a person who needed things named clearly before she could work with them. He looked at her for a long moment. A partner, he said, the same word I'd use for this ranch, someone who stands on equal ground. He paused. Someone who tells me when I'm wrong and means it. Someone who doesn't disappear when things are hard. Another pause, shorter. Someone to eat supper at the same table. She looked at him. She thought about Nora saying he almost laughed. She thought about Evan riding home alone after the hearing because he'd needed it. She thought about the kitchen fire she built every morning before the sun came up, and the specific quality of belonging she'd been careful not to name. I'll need time, she said. I know, he said. He wasn't disappointed. She could see that he understood that a woman who had been left on a platform by a man who'd taken 6 months to decide he didn't want her was entitled to time before deciding she wanted someone else. But, she said, he waited. I think you should know, she said, that I stopped examining it about 2 weeks ago. He understood what she was saying. She could see him understand it, the small, significant shift in his expression, controlled but real. All right, he said. All right, she said. She picked up the cloth and finished wiping the work table. He poured himself the last of the coffee from the pot, which was nearly cold, and drank it without complaint, and they stood in the kitchen together in the easy, unforced way of people who had already been in the same space for long enough to stop performing comfort and simply have it. Spring came to the Double C the way Wyoming spring always came reluctantly, in pieces with reversals. There would be a week of thaw, and then a late freeze that killed the optimism the thaw had produced, and then another thaw, and eventually the snow retreated to the high ground and the mud season arrived, which was its own particular problem. Mara watched it from the kitchen window every morning while the coffee was on. She had come to know this view the way she knew her own hands intimately, without having to look at it closely to know what was there. The conversation in the kitchen had led to other conversations, less formal, distributed across the weeks that followed the hearing. They talked in the way of people who were learning each other without the urgency of early feeling carefully, without compression, with the specific patience of two people who had both been burned by moving too fast toward a thing that turned out to be different from what they'd thought it was. He told her about Margaret. Not all at once in pieces, across evenings in the kitchen or on the porch when the weather permitted and the children were inside. He told her what Margaret had been like, which turned out to be different from what Mara had constructed in her imagination from the evidence of the oversized coat and the children's grief. Margaret had been funny in a dry, unexpected way. She had been stubborn about specific things and flexible about others, and she had driven Caleb to the edge of his patience once by repainting the barn door red without telling him, because she thought the brown was depressing and she was right. Mara liked her, in the abstract way you could like a person you'd never met who had clearly left good evidence behind. She would have had something to say about me, Mara said once. She would have had something to say about everything, Caleb said. She'd have watched you for about a week and then told me exactly what she thought and been right. And what would she have thought? He considered this honestly. She'd have said you were the most practical person she'd ever met, and that was either the most useful thing in the world or a wall, depending on which side you were on. He paused. She'd have liked you once she decided. Mara thought about this. How long did it take her to decide things? Less time than you'd expect, he said. She was quick that way. He looked at her sideways. You're not quick, you're thorough. There's a difference, she said. I know, he said. I prefer thorough. It was Evan who brought it up first, which surprised her. He came to the kitchen on a Saturday morning in early March with the focused, slightly sideways approach he still used when he had something to say that he wasn't sure how to begin. She was making oatmeal. She'd come back around to oatmeal after Tommy's comment in the first week because she had the oat supply now and it was the most efficient morning food in terms of sustained energy, and she'd stopped being self-conscious about it. I know about you and Papa, he said. She looked at the pot. What do you know? That there's something. He stood with his arms crossed, which was his version of Hawthorne's arms crossed in the doorway posture, and she found the similarity briefly, privately affecting. Nora knows too. She's known longer than me. Of course she has, Mara said. Evan was quiet for a moment. She let him take his time. My mother's been gone 14 months, he said. Almost 15. I know. I used to think he stopped. Started again. After she died, I thought, if Papa ever, I thought I'd hate it. I thought it would feel like he was saying she didn't matter. He uncrossed his arms. His hands went into his pockets. But it doesn't feel like that. She looked up from the pot now. It feels like. He frowned at the kitchen wall, looking for the word. He was 13 and the word was too old for 13. but he was looking for it anyway because he was Evan, and he needed to understand things precisely. It feels like the house got its weight back, he said. Like it was listing, and now it isn't. She didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that wouldn't be smaller than what he'd just given her. I'm not saying it's the same, he said quickly, as though he needed her to know he hadn't been sentimental about it. It isn't the same. You're not her. The house isn't what it was. He paused. But it's something. Yes, she said it is. He nodded. He took his hands out of his pockets. He went to the work table and picked up the bread knife and began cutting the bread she'd left cooling there, in even slices, the same way Nora cut it, slightly uneven, concentrated, real. She went back to the oatmeal. Nora's version was less complicated and therefore more direct. She appeared in the kitchen 2 days later and said, without preamble, "If you and Papa get married, do I call you Mama?" Mara looked at her. Nora looked back with the round, serious eyes that never really stopped assessing. "You can call me whatever you want," Mara said carefully. "There's no requirement." Nora thought about this with the visible concentration she brought to things that mattered. "I'll think about it," she said, and went out, which was exactly what Mara would have done at 9 years old, and she found this more comforting than she could have explained. Caleb Hawthorne proposed on a Tuesday, which was a completely ordinary Tuesday in late March, the kind of day that had no particular claim to significance. Mud season fully arrived. The sky, the flat, colorless overcast of a day that hadn't decided what kind of weather it intended to be. He came into the kitchen after the morning ride, which he always did. He poured his own coffee, now had been doing it for weeks without asking, because they'd both stopped performing the formalities of employer and employee without announcing that they'd stopped. He stood at the counter and drank it and said, "I'd like to do this properly, so I'm going to ask you properly." He set the cup down. He looked at her. He didn't have his hat in his hands this time. He'd put it on the hook at the door, which he also did now, automatically, without her having to suggest it. "Mara Whitmore, will you marry me?" Not a question exactly. A proposition made by a man who had thought it through completely and was stating it the way he stated all things he was certain of directly, without decoration, with the confidence of someone who understood that the substance was the argument. She looked at him across the kitchen. She thought about Ohio. She thought about the dry goods store and 6 years of ledgers and the particular loneliness of a life that had been reduced to its most functional components. She thought about the 6 letters and the $62 in the platform and the way the cold had cut through her coat while the entire town of Coulter's Creek watched her future evaporate. She thought about everything she'd built since then: the kitchen, the bread schedule, the molasses on Fridays, the survey map and the stone marker and Pete Garber's wrist, and 31 hours of soup and biscuits in a blizzard in the hearing room, and Nora's hand through her arm on the wagon home. She thought about what it meant to be handed one chance, not a rescue, not a kindness exactly. Just a door opened by someone who needed something practical and had the decency to ask her instead of talking around her, and what you could build through it if you had the will and the specific stubbornness that came from having nowhere left to retreat. "Yes," she said. He exhaled, not dramatically, just the breath of a man who has been holding something and can now let it go. He came around the work table and stood in front of her, and she looked at him. This man she had spent 3 months learning with the same careful attention she brought to everything she needed to understand. And she thought that he was not perfect, and she was not perfect, and the ranch was genuinely demanding, and Wyoming winter was not going to become more hospitable because she'd decided to marry into it. She thought all of that, and she still meant yes. He didn't make a speech about it. He put his hands on either side of her face briefly. The way you hold something you're making sure is real. And she put one hand flat on his chest and felt his heart, which was beating faster than he was letting on. And that specific, human, unglamorous fact of a steady man whose heart was beating hard was the thing that made it fully real to her. They married in June. Not in a church. The ceremony was in the yard of the Double C, on a morning that had come in clear and cool and stayed that way, with the light the way Wyoming light was in early summer, sharp-edged and clean. Mrs. Brower came, and the Aldriches, and Clara Prentice and her husband, and Tommy Birch in his polished boots, and a new shirt that still had the fold marks from the store. Chester and Red and Pete and the other hands stood along the fence rail in varying states of grooming, and Duggan the cattle buyer came, and old Harris from the county records office, and half a dozen others who had been on the right side of that hearing room in January. Nora had decided sometime in the weeks between March and June that the answer to her own question was this. She would call her Nothing Different for now and see what happened, because some things needed time to find their name. Mara had accepted this as entirely reasonable. Evan stood beside his father during the ceremony, with the controlled composure of a 14-year-old who had decided that not crying was a decision he was going to make, and was making it with everything he had. He made it until Mrs. Brower, standing behind him, put her hand very briefly on his shoulder, and he had to look at the sky for a moment. He looked at the sky and then looked back and kept his composure, and she was not going to say anything about it. Ever. The ceremony itself was short. The justice of the peace who came out from Coulter's Creek was a practical man who understood that the people in front of him had already done the work of deciding and didn't need language to dress it up further. The vows were the standard words, but she meant each one with the specific weight of someone who understands that a promise is not a feeling. It's a decision you make in advance about how you're going to behave when the feeling isn't convenient. She understood this the way she understood most things, from experience. Afterward, in the yard, with the gathering finding its rhythm, and Tommy producing a harmonica from somewhere that no one had known about, and Chester eating his third piece of the wedding cake that Mara had made herself the day before, a plain butter cake with a jam filling. Practical and good, she stood for a moment at the edge of the gathering and looked at all of it. She saw Caleb talking to Duggan near the fence, the particular posture of men discussing something, real cattle prices, or the spring grass on the north pasture, or the condition of the road after the wet spring, and she thought that this was who he was, that he would always be partly in the practical world of the ranch, even at his own wedding. And she found this not disappointing, but correct. Was who she was too. She saw Nora sitting on the porch step with Mrs. Brower, the two of them in conversation with the ease of people who had found each other useful, which was Mrs. Brower's highest form of affection. Nora was explaining something with her hands, that specific Nora gesture, the one she used when the subject mattered to her and Mrs. Brower was listening with the complete attention she gave to things worth her time. She saw Evan at the far side of the yard talking to Tommy. Tommy was saying something that was making Evan produce the specific expression that was his version of almost locking. He'd never quite gotten all the way to it yet, but he was closer than he'd been in January, closer than he'd been when she arrived. The stone in his boot was still there. She didn't think it would ever be gone entirely. But he was learning in the gradual and imperfect way of people who are genuinely trying to walk with it differently. And she thought about something that she had not been able to think clearly until this moment, standing at the edge of her own wedding in the June light of Wyoming, with the harmonica starting up behind her, and the smell of the butter cake, and the horses, and the particular dry sweetness of the summer grass. She thought about what it meant to arrive somewhere with nothing, with $62 in a suitcase and a future someone else had just destroyed, and to build from that nothing, a kitchen, a household, a community of people who showed up in a courtroom because they'd seen what you were, and eventually a life, not because someone rescued you, not because the world decided to be kind, because the world was not reliably kind, and she had never expected it to be, but because you found one door that opened not through luck entirely, not through design entirely, but through the specific combination of a practical man with a problem and a woman who refused to stand still, and you walked through it, and you did the work. She had been left on that platform, and she had decided in the 3 seconds before she answered the question, "What do I do now?" that she was not going to build her future out of what had been done to her. She was going to build it out of what she could do. That was the only thing she knew for certain. Not a philosophy, not a comfort, just a fact she'd learned the way she'd learned everything else. Through trial and error, mostly error, and the kind of stubbornness that doesn't know its courage until afterward. Caleb broke away from Duggan and walked toward her across the yard, with the unhurried stride of a man who was not performing anything for anyone. He came to stand beside her. "What are you thinking?" he said. She looked out at the gathering. "I'm taking inventory," she said. He looked where she was looking. "What does it come to?" she considered. "More than I started with," she said. "Considerably more." He didn't say anything to that. He stood beside her and looked at his ranch and his children and the people who had come to stand with them. And after a while, he put his hand in hers, not dramatically, just set it there, warm and solid and matter-of-fact, the hand of a working man, and she held it. Tommy's harmonica found a tune she half recognized. Chester, who turned out to have opinions about music, said something corrective about the tempo, and Tommy ignored him with the cheerful completeness he brought to all of Chester's opinions, and Red Garber laughed, the surprise laugh that was always involuntary and always real. Nora looked up from the porch steps and found Mara across the yard and waved once, a small wave, a child's wave, and then went back to Mrs. Brower. Evan, from the far side of the yard, did not wave. He caught her eye once, briefly, with the directness that was the best of what he was, no performance, no softening, and he nodded. One single nod. She nodded back. That was enough. That was, in fact, exactly enough. She had come to Wyoming with $62 in a suitcase and the kind of future that had just been publicly revoked. She was leaving that version of herself behind, not because anyone had saved her from it, but because she had looked at what was available and done something with it. That was the only miracle she believed in, the ordinary, unglamorous daily miracle of a person deciding what they're going to do next, and then doing it imperfectly, persistently, without stopping when it was hard. She had not been rescued. She had been handed one chance, just one, nothing more, and she had built the rest herself. The summer morning moved around her, warm and full and real, and Mara Whitmore, Mara Hawthorne now, though it would take her a week to stop catching herself, stood in the yard of the Double C, and held her husband's hand and watched her family, and thought that the woman who had stepped off that train in November would not recognize this moment. But she would understand exactly how it had been built. That was the difference between being saved and being capable. One of them happened to you. The other one was yours.